And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it's been the insane political week. This is what we've been getting, interestingly enough.
And why is it so insane?
Well, even the thing about Martha's Vineyard and migrants and all this kind of action, and moving people around like they're tools on a board. They had the huge stock market crash today, which I think is significant, along with the worst inflation in a generation. So we're looking at really economic devastation, and then the rhetoric from the top is all fluffy goodness, like, hey, it's the Inflation Reduction Act, everyone.
Well, they're not feeling the pain.
Yeah, exactly. Driving around in fancy cars. And I don't know. I don't know where that's going. I'm not sure what the image makers have in mind, but tonight cuts right into that because, interestingly enough, as I was preparing a very interesting deep state report for everyone, I kept coming back to some things in the mystery school teachings about the period that we're in and the extent to which these schools are involved in the background, both left-hand schools and those who are trying to move the society forward. And back there was a whole piece in my mind about the Great White Brotherhood and how they may be involved in all of these social upheavals that we're seeing. And I thought we needed that kind of eagle-eye lens on the whole situation before I brought some of those political facts in. And to see the balance between the two, and also to understand the kind of drumbeat of this sort of oppressive social media wave and keeping us all in that reactionary state. So tonight we're going to do things a little bit differently because we're going to be looking at the influence of the mystery schools on the situation and the battles that are taking place from the point of view of the Great White Brotherhood versus these occult left-hand path mystery schools, and the struggle that's going on. And, so many people love the thumbnail for this episode.
I know.
Which is great. But you have kind of the back and forth there because you have Lamb suited right in the middle, and he is that large-headed being that Crowley conjured and who gave him a good deal of knowledge. And there's no question that the great resemblance that he has to an ET. I think there's a video that Gigi Young did about this. And it's quite interesting, I think, when you think about Crowley and his relationship to the UFO file, which comes up a few times because of the timing of so many things with his teaching and because of his relationship with the California branch of the OTO. But I think what's interesting is when we look at Lamb and then the juxtaposition to Rata, we have kind of two high priests there from the different schools. And I think in the case of Lamb, we're looking at somebody who really is at the apex of that kind of transhumanist piece, which I think is coming to the fore right now. And he's getting, Crowley's getting that instruction directly from Lamb in this direct teaching, and he seems to have kind of reached his apex in a way at that point when he's getting this instruction. With Rata, it's quite fascinating because Rata, of course, a very early priest of the Emilius Brotherhood, and he is an early incarnation of Edgar Cayce, and he's back there with Hermes, who is a direct initiate from the Great White Brotherhood in the mystery school cosmology and lineage. And they in 10,500 BC are laying out the Giza Plateau and encasing inside of it all of those predictions for everything that's unfolding now. And this is one of the key periods about it. And it's interesting, because a lot of people will say, well, pyramid prophecies, what's that all about? That question did come up in 1932 in an Edgar Cayce reading. And they asked him point blank, are there predictions in the pyramid? And he was like, absolutely. And they're all being fulfilled now. And they said, well, how can we tell, what they are? And he said, well, in the type of stone and the curve and entering into the king's chamber, which is the period we're entering into now, where there's an empty sarcophagus. And the empty sarcophagus signifying the understanding of death or life after death. and the spiritual nature of that whole thing, because that's the initiatory practice that the Egyptians had. And they said, well, how accurate are these prophecies? And he said, well, if they're read correctly, they can be as accurate as understanding the place and the city and even the street and the address of the people that are involved. So when it's making predictions about people, it's that specific. What does that tell you about chance and coincidence in the world? Makes you wonder, indeed. But we're looking at something there when we come up against this idea of the schools. The Great White Brotherhood is basically the ultimate mystery school when you look at it from this perspective. And that is the key to so many of these groups coming out in the 1870s, 1880s, and really creating that whole wave of the public mystery schools that were kind of looking back at and getting that incredible wave into the 21st century. When they were looking out at things for us in the 21st century, it was a great challenging piece for us, and they understood it, and they gave us these tools going forward. But one of the things that's in there, if you really read the literature, is that the left-hand path schools have basically all the same tools as the deep mystery schools. So therefore, it's kind of a race between those deeper schools that are trying to move the culture forward, who are identified with the Great White Brotherhood, and these other schools, which are concerned with the kind of Crowleyite, moving things right as might kind of position. But I would also say that one of the things I found out from reading Rudolf Steiner's work is that we're looking at a split there in the schools themselves. So that's going to be interesting, and we'll get into that tonight, because the schools on the left-hand side, apparently there's, left-hand path schools just going after their own, will, desire, and the kind of selfish fulfillment of their magical knowledge. But then there are other groups that are much darker indeed and are much more sinister. So that goes into the very deep left-hand path. And on the right-hand path, you have the same thing. You have right-hand schools that are doing good work, and then you have really incredible right-hand schools. And so there are variances and degrees on these, of course. So when we get to the Great White Brotherhood and their incredible influence, we're looking at something that very well qualifies as an ultimate mystery school. Now, I want to remind you, as we're here in X Series 134, this exciting episode, which is getting deep into that Great White Brotherhood versus the occult Eighth Sphere schools, and how the Eighth Sphere plays into the period that we're in, that we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. So you can ask those now. Miss Olivia is going to be checking in with those. And before we go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Interesting. Wilbur Wobbler says either of those paths, quote, shine?
Well, shine is a term, just that's where they got the shining from. Shine is to have sort of extrasensory abilities. So I think that's the manner in which you're speaking. So I would say they both shine in that sense. But yeah, that is an interesting phrase. And the fact that it's Kubrick that picked up on that one, I think is kind of fascinating.
And there's the reference to shining ones.
Oh, yes.
So who would they be?
Well, if you see someone who is operating on that ascended master place, then you're looking at someone who's just overcome the physical and is operating from the etheric astral realm, coming back and trying to help those that are struggling with physical issues on the material plane. This is the nature of that. So the shining ones then become those who are ascended beyond this path, but then appear to us. They apparently, though, have abilities that really are supernatural and, sound to us like science fiction. But what's interesting is even among those who are, just really good initiates, let's say like a Gurdjieff or a Blavatsky, they had the ability to do things that would astound us on a physical level, like project themselves to different places and take part in events there. They're both known to have done that. As a matter of fact, I have an account tonight from Henry Alcott talking about how Helena Blavatsky had done this while she was in Philadelphia, came back to New York and dealt with a bunch of things. So it wasn't two places at the same time. Well, how does that even happen? The nature of the things that are taught in these schools, and you can see why they keep so much of it secret, is that it involves abilities that are supranormal. And when we get into that realm, then it gets into the realm of, so often it's imagination or fantasy when we hear people talking about this, or they have mental issues. But when it actually happens, it's taking part in the fact that this person has learned the initiatory skill. And the idea of people who are on the left-hand path learning that skill is very disturbing indeed. But in Gurdjieff's case, Ouspensky, when he observed it up close, he observed the ability for Gurdjieff to shapeshift into completely other people. And the term that he used was plastics. This is interesting because he's talking about this maybe in 1921. So it's not really, there's no real common knowledge about plastic surgery because plastic's not even really in the zeitgeist yet. So plastics is an interesting term for us to go back and research from that period. What exactly are you talking about? But it's that ability to make your form malleable and project different things on it. He also recounts something, Ouspensky, in Search of the Miraculous, in relation to his relationship with Gurdjieff, where he was traveling on a train from Finland after leaving Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff shows up in his compartment and talks to him, for half of his trip. So these aren't normal people when you look back at them. And so I think for that fact, people like Gurdjieff and Blavatsky really get a lot of slander in retrospect because people look back on them and there's a lot of fantastic stories about them, etc. And I think that this is part of the left-hand schools trying to discourage people from the good leaders by, exploiting stories about them. Blavatsky had a fight with her housekeeper, and the housekeeper said she was a fraud, so that must be true. Or, a guy like Rudolf Steiner is not going to base anthroposophy off the base of theosophy if it's run by a charlatan, so let's get real. Blavatsky was an incredible, gifted one, and she was definitely an initiate. Now, even when you get up at that level, you can have personality issues and you can have all kinds of human foibles that in retrospect are going to make you look bad. But I think it's very important not to fall for that because we see a lot of that in relation to theosophy and anthroposophy. There's always this process going on in the popular media where they're like, well, anthroposophy, oh, that's like some kind of Nazi Superman philosophy or something. I mean, the Nazis hated Steiner with a passion. They burnt down his Goetheanum building. Obviously, it was not a Nazi mystical movement. So, those are just kind of uninformed things. But we get into them and we dissect them and diffuse them ultimately. And we also deal with the faults of groups like Theosophy, which really fell apart at a certain point, and Anthroposophy picked up where they left off. But that foundation was important. And so you're not going to dismiss all the incredible things from that remarkable theosophical awakening just because after 20 or 30 years, the movement went awry. And this is the nature of it. Right now, if you look at a lot of the different movements and things we've seen, it's dramatically cultish, the thread of things, so much so that I think there's a lot of exhaustion with groups and spiritual groups and a lot of the things that we hear about gurus and things of that nature. There's too much exploitation involved, too much marketing. There's an incredible story about Krishnamurti, and Krishnamurti was amazing because he just was a no BS kind of teacher, and he'd been groomed.
That is so true.
That's amazing. And he was really groomed by Theosophy to become the leader of this Order of the Star, and he was going to be the leader of humanity, the world teacher. And he bowed out of all that. He gave back everything, including castles in Europe and stuff, in order to just go his own way. And actually, he became a student of Ouspensky's. But what's interesting about him is he was somebody who was disgusted by the time they got into the 60s and 70s, with the activity from the gurus and this whole thing, the whole thing about Maharishi and the Beatles and this kind of high celebrity level of these yogis, and just that whole thing that was going on in that period about, I need my guru and here's my life savings, and that whole thing. And he recalls this very interesting incident in his own autobiography where, he was looking forward to meeting this guru from the East, and he knew so many of them because he was from India himself. And when he meets the guy, finally, the guy doesn't talk about anything spiritual, but he lays out a map and shows him how many different followers he has in different countries. And then he starts doing the math of what that's worth to him. So, there's a kind of an uneasy thing that took place from the 60s really through the 80s, which was the Eastern influence getting a level of corruption from all this Western money and interest pouring into it in the 60s, which was a real delayed reaction of almost 100 years from when Theosophy had hit, that suddenly in the 60s, this thing really caught on. But it is interesting when you look back at that history, because it seemed like on the one hand, we got this very dependent culture on the Western side, and for the Eastern magic and the gurus, and I need my guru and that whole thing. And then the gurus themselves becoming very commercial, as Krishnamurti had noted, this was, there's nothing spiritual about this particular leader. And I think that there are a lot of them like that, and how many scandals have we seen associated with it? It doesn't mean that all, Maharishi types are bad, or even Maharishi is. They may know a great deal, but it is, as I pointed out, this kind of uneasy thing, the kind of easy money that was involved. And what we've seen, I think there's a kind of a commercialization that comes after cable TV, and almost like a home shopping club spirituality that takes place. So things have been off course for a while, and then you get things like Gaia TV, and that they're trying to promote the latest trend and really cash in on the latest trend. So it doesn't have anything to do with actual spirituality. So what do you do in those instances? Well, it's interesting to learn how the thread developed and what they were projecting out for us, and how the period that we walk into here in the 21st century has all been laid out. But I do feel like when we look back at these periods, we have to understand, if you study the mystery schools and you study these groups, what you learn is that the teachers, the only way for them to advance up is when someone gets advanced enough to take their place. And so, some of the people like Gurdjieff were always looking for the ultimate student who could get on his level so he could move up the ladder. And I think what we're looking at, the way that I understand all the things that have been laid out there for us, is if the culture as it is understands the teachings of the mystery schools, then we get the next wave in that sense. But it seems to me that they laid out a bunch of stuff and then laid back, and they watched the different groups get into it. And, some people had a lot of important experiences over those decades, but I don't think that the type of the quality of advancement in society and culture happened. I think many of these things went into this kind of circle of reaction and dependency. That was the very things that the schools were trying to lift. One of the things you learn when you study anthroposophy is that the early schools, the early period of the schools coming forward around the 1840s and 1850s, there's tons of experimentation with the public. So that the public is, they're learning what they can lay out to the society in chunks, because there are parts of those groups that don't want to lay anything out. And there are also a large amount of left-hand school groups who don't want to share that great advancement. The more responsible groups on the right-hand side want to share it, but share it responsibly. So you do have this thing where someone has to be worthy of receiving this kind of information. So it's an interesting push-pull as we go, and people holding back information for good reasons and for bad reasons. And but that thread of experimentation and how we see mediumship and spiritualism and all these different things come to the fore during the 1850s and 60s with the Fox sisters and groups of this nature, and seances and all of this understanding of the afterworld, is in fact a plan on behalf of the mystery schools to advance the culture and fight off this wave of scientific materialism, which is driving towards this eighth sphere peace. And that's what we're going to get into tonight. And I have all the best people to quote from to do it. We're also going to cover some very interesting lines of thought in relation to the period that we're in, and how this whole thing about, inserting brain chips into our mind. And I don't know if you saw that. Did you see that whole Klaus Schwab thing where he's like, imagine for a moment here, it's 10 years from now and everyone has a brain chip. And when they do the applause, you can feel what they're thinking. And he's talking to the Google Go founder, and the guy's like, oh yeah, I can picture this, and I can picture immortality on the internet. When you look at that, you can see that, this understanding around the eighth sphere and the peace that we're talking about, specifically how it's related to transhumanism. And it is extraordinary that Steiner would lay this out 100 years in advance. And it does feel almost like a time machine, and then you go back there and you look at some of the other stuff he writes, and it's like, oh, that seems exactly like the period that they were talking about. So he had the ability to be in the time period that he was and jump forward. So that whole predictive side of Steiner, I think, makes him stand out dramatically. And you'll notice that is kind of a signature with Blavatsky and Casey, Steiner and Gurdjieff, as they're all projecting ahead for what's happening and trying to supply the right reinforcements at the right time. What is it that they left behind? And was it this central great white brotherhood? What is, where did that come from that was supplying them with this? What is it with all these schools and brotherhoods anyway? We're going to get into that tonight. So before we get into it, I have a couple of quick things I want to mention around this UFO file piece, which has been really exploited heavy. Before I do that, I want to also ask Miss Olivia, how you doing out there? How's the temperature?
Doing great. I think we need to start with some basics to get everybody up to speed.
I think we just did.
No, well, I'll give you an example. So AG is asking, so is the left-hand path Satanism and the right-hand path Luciferianism? That's not true.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I did say that there's variations and degrees of that. So that's something we'll get into a little bit deeper. But
and
certainly,
where does the Christ consciousness come in?
Well, that's, I mean, certainly the Western mystery schools are associated with Christ. That's their Christian, their esoteric Christian schools. And anthroposophy is Rosicrucian. So, that's the Knights of the Rosy Cross. This is the Western esoteric model. And the entire Western esoteric model was to bring in the Christian influence, which they succeeded in doing. And Christ succeeded in its mission. But what's interesting is, and this is kind of fascinating, but Steiner often points to the fact that the kind of robotic reciting of Christian principles can be very harmonic. So if you get a real Bible thumper, you can be looking at someone who has learned it by rote and is almost hypnotized by the thing. And that's a very harmonic activity. It's a kind of addictive thing. So, I think Christians take a lot of heat, honestly. And I think in culture and in society, you see them targeted more and more because it is that Christian understanding that is something that the establishment wants to wipe out because they want to elect themselves in that position. And it's very interesting because if you go into anthroposophy, he's suggesting that Ahriman masquerades as Christ as well.
Wow.
So how do you figure that one? Let's get into that one. It's not just a straight up, hey, we're going to come out and say we're anti-God. They're going to elect themselves into that position. And, and you will look at a number of things that they'll be able to do. One of the things that Steiner talks about them being able to do is give everyone clairvoyance. And you can tell that they're moving toward this. They're going to give us the ability. We already have the ability for telepathy and things like that. But the machines are going to start reading our minds. And this is something that we have to be prepared for. And if we know a little more about the basics of these things, then we'll understand it, because they're doing a lot of experimentation now. There's no question about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Great questions already. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of this. Before we do anything else, I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch and lets you know about the incredible interviews and X-Series episodes that we have coming up for you. We have some great interviews coming up for September and October, just off the charts. And we're going to have some great documentary action coming up for you later in the fall, and some announcements of events and things like that. So make sure, stand up and be counted, and make sure you're on that newsletter list. And you'll get it about once a week. And basically, with the kind of censorship that we've been seeing, you want to make sure you do it, because, you know, I love the whole social media network thing myself, and I don't have any problems with it except for the censorship. And so you just never know when they get into an election season, you know, here today, gone tomorrow. So we're going into a particularly ugly election season.
You think?
So this is going to be the nature of the thing. But what else do you have?
I have lots of questions myself. So
Yes.
as far as the Great White Brotherhood is concerned, are they a group of all ascended masters, or are some of them, have they never actually incarnated here before and worked their way up to ascension?
No, I think the idea is that they have incarnated here and then moved from our plane to physical mastery. So some of the members of the White Brotherhood would be folks like Saint Germain, for example. And, you know, these different types of ascended masters who've gone through periods in different times and overcome the physical. And there can also be entities and beings who are from higher realms, and they basically influence the whole. So this is also something that's understood. And it's interesting, I think, again, when you get to anthroposophy, it's very unusual, because he talks about how in the next phase that we're coming into, that what's going to happen is, whereas basically the development cycle has been in charge, one of these beings from these other realms has been in charge of it. So either solar beings or Venus beings and things of this nature that the initiates were originally influenced by, that it's going to be a human, you know, an advanced human, someone who is an initiate here, who's going to be in charge of that process. So this is very interesting switch out.
This is fascinating. Jay Vanderbest says the left-hand path is individuation, the right-hand path unification. Tommy Connolly says, in India, if you don't have a guru or a temple that you frequent, then you are on the left-hand path, because it is the path of individuation.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I mean, there's obviously a negative connotation with the left-hand path, that they are using all of the tools for knowledge for their own self-advancement, and that it comes down to a very selfish ideal, exemplified kind of in the Crowley type movement. Now, I think there is a differentiation between that and, you know, true Satanism or dark occult ritual aspects. I think that that's a difference. I think that those are both operate in that left sphere, but there's a big difference between them. But, you know, when you're talking about right-hand path schools, you're talking about trying to advance the culture. So it's a very different movement. And it's kind of the same difference between the deep state and, say, kind of the Kennedy wing of the political movement. You know, they were trying to move the culture and balance things out. They weren't looking to exacerbate the differences. And even though they were coming from a very privileged position, the Kennedys wanted to include this idea of global freedom, which is why they encountered so much sort of left-hand opposition. So I think that those things need to be kept in mind. It's not just that on the left-hand path, hey, they're just more individual. No, I mean, they've aborted the idea, the premise of service. So, if you look at the nature of the mystery schools, it's the two principles that are involved are attunement and service. So they're not just interested on the right-hand path with, the tools that they can ascend to heaven with. The idea is if you have tools for ascension, then you do something with it. And I've used those examples before when they came to Casey and asked him about these different things. And they were looking for him to give them answers on telepathy and psychic powers and all that. And he certainly did. But at the same time, he really got to something else, which is he said, basically to put yourself in the right frame of mind for this, you have to go out and do something for somebody else, for someone who can't do it for themselves, And it didn't mean being a doormat or something for somebody. One of the examples he gave, and it's pretty funny because it's in the Search for God groups, when people are bringing in these ideas like, how will I be able to project my astral body to take part in events, in another place? And he said, well, the first thing to do is put yourself in the right frame of mind by pushing an elderly person in a wheelchair along Virginia Beach. There's something about that service aspect that we have to keep in mind. This is why in Christianity, the Christian missionary piece and spreading that and the whole idea of service is there because the ultimate guru is the one who's the servant of all, right? It's not just somebody everyone throws flowers at their feet and worships them. That's, that actually lends itself to just the opposite. And so I think there needs to be a service aspect involved with there. That's just kind of the fundamental basics. And the left-hand path stuff can be absolutely fascinating, but a lot of it doesn't have any of this service aspect. It's all, kind of glorify yourself through all these different techniques. So that can be a trap. And some people would say, even though you develop remarkable techniques working on that left-hand side, occult techniques, and they are very interesting, but to what end? How are you developing as an individual, as a being? That would be a kind of a key question in all this. Everyone, you're watching X Series 134. We're going deep. Tonight, we're going to have it out with the Great White Brotherhood and the occult 8 sphere groups clashing, one versus the other. That's the left versus the right. How does that happen? And what is the nature of the jujitsu that takes place there? We're taking your questions in the second half of the program. I'm going to read a couple of things on this UFO bit before we get deep into the mystery schools. And because I think this is all related, especially since so much of the mystery thing, they keep talking about these spirits of the air. And when I did a study on Charles Lindbergh, I became fascinated that he had so many mystical experiences while he was flying around up there as the first person to cross the Atlantic. So I started to wonder about that and how that's a key occult piece, and also the fact that Armageddon, according to Casey, is the idea that it's fought in the air between the souls leaving from the earth and those returning to the earth. So it's a kind of a prevention from those higher forces coming in. That is the Battle of Armageddon in Casey terms. Of course, when you hear Armageddon and you're an average person up here in Boston, especially with all the liberals walking around, there's not a lot of church culture. Armageddon sounds like it's a far out Christian concept and like only a crazy Christian would believe it. Interestingly enough, though, all of those things have foundation. Yes, they may be latched onto, and there's been a lot of hell and brimstone preachers who've brought that message home, and we all have a resistance to that. The Jerry Falwell and the whole kind of hypocrisy of that whole thing, the kind of too simplest spirituality of televangelism. But at the same time, the core concepts are there. And I think we can go back with this kind of mystical eye on those things and read them and bring them to life in a way that is not so simplified, and that really kind of goes to the original idea of what they were in the first place. So I'm going to read this, a couple of weird things on this UFO file tip. As you know, we've been observing this UFO threat meme that's being placed out there in the public by different groups like Homeland Security, the Central Intelligence Agency, which, by the way, celebrates 75th birthday today. This is your life, CIA.
Mhm.
Obfuscation, assassination, wall of secrecy, you name it on the UFO file. Congratulations. But I would say this, that it's real interesting to observe this, because I think this is all related. And I think that the UFO piece they're trying to put forward is very much related to them giving us a different origin story and creating a fear mechanism. And it's funny because I've read recently a lot of different lefties who are out there who just don't quite understand. They know something's wrong with how the government's bringing up this UFO file threat, but they can't get their heads wrapped around it. And what I want to say to those people is, it's very simple. They've been building the threat for 75 years. 1. 2, the idea of a worldwide UFO threat is the ultimate emergency piece, which is what they built the continuity of government framework for. And 3, that they've tried since 2017 to sell us a bill of goods with phony whistleblowers like Lou Elizondo and Christopher Mellon, and these people who claim to be, I'm against the government. And we find out in research, as I've pointed out before, that those people work for the government. So, they are the government, in fact. But we've been watching them and keeping an eye on them. And, a lot of people wanted to know my opinion about Gary Nolan. Gary Nolan's just pure CIA. This is a pure CIA op. And he was, by the way, the original founding member of the To the Stars Academy. Did you know that? So the whole CIA operation of TTSA is something that's crucial for us to, when we look at those people, when those people come out of the woodwork and you see them showing up on Tucker Carlson and all that, they've been so discredited, but there's so much money behind them that they need some part of that operation to work. And so they keep regrouping it and reframing it until they can get that perception management campaign dead on. And so that's what they're doing. But one of these things I noticed is that all these politicians out of nowhere have been jumping onto the UFO bandwagon. And I think to myself, I've never seen them in the UFO thing before until this weird wave came about, right? Until you started hearing about Arrow and the UAP task force and all this stuff. Where do these people come from? Where did their interest in the UFO file come from? Because it wasn't there before. So one of the key ones is Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee, who's always out there like, we got to find out about those aliens, boys. So here he says in a tweet, I talked to Leland Vittert at News Nation about the Navy's refusal to release UAP videos to the public. Americans deserve to know what information our government has on these encounters. This is the thing. So what they did is they did a marketing program, and they realized that the public was up in arms after 30 years of UFO specials and coast to coast and all kinds of stuff. And they do want answers about Area 51 and all the rest of it. And so they've decided to take a few politicians who have nothing to do with this thing and make them pretend that they're angry at the government won't give them this. And just like they came out with the phony whistleblower Elizondo and pretended, he quit the Pentagon so he could get the truth about UFOs. And then you go through and you find he's still working for the Pentagon. On record, by the way. That's not just me saying that. So this is very important because they figured out here a marketing niche. And we need to be on the same level with them, because their level of the PSYOP with us is extremely dangerous, because we already saw what they did with the COVID emergency op, right? How do you like not going to church, having the freedom of assembly taken away, freedom of speech? How do you like that being taken away? So, we know what they would do would be 10 times worse with the UFO threat. Let's face it. But a lot of people on the left, it did fascinate me that they couldn't quite grasp that. And I understand it, because there's nothing on the left in relation to this. Oddly enough, so much of the looking through this stuff, is just on the independent side and on the right side. and the left really needs to catch up on that. There shouldn't be any difference at all politically on this. But anyway, Burchett is actually a right winger. So so he says we have to get Americans deserve to know. So what I did under his tweet is I said, what got you interested in UFOs, Congressman? This is the key question. That's the tweet, by the way. And this is absolutely important. What got them interested in UFOs? I want to hear the story. Give us the narrative. Where did Kirsten Gillibrand get interested in UFOs? When's the first UFO hearing that you heard about, the first UFO sighting? How about Marco Rubio? Did you grow up with UFOs? Were you fascinated by the X-Files? What is it? Why are all these people in government so fascinated with UFOs all of a sudden? What do they know? Is there a financial gravy train coming with a phony threat narrative on top of it? And do they all want to jump on board? That's what it looks like. And I've got a list of 15 people in government who are jumping on this UFO bandwagon. Ruben Galejo is one of them, congressman in New Mexico. Burchett, of course, Gillibrand, Rubio, and others. So what are we looking at there? They're being told in the background, hey. And another thing that's going on is, you know, they have these private hearings in the back rooms there. Oh, this isn't for public consumption. And so they do the public hearing and nobody really says anything important except, oh, we need to punish amateur UFO interest groups, which they said that on the record, Defense Department and Illinois congressman. And then they'll come out after that and say, oh, we're going into a private session meeting. And this guy, Burchett, he claims that a Defense Department official reached into his back pocket and took out an iPhone and showed him classified footage of a UFO. They're not going to keep classified footage of a UFO on their iPhone. This is also something that apparently Lou Elizondo tried to impress some people with, like, oh, look at my phone. I've got this secret stuff. You're not going to keep secret stuff on an iPhone. All right. First of all, you'll go to jail forever. And so this is part of the wave of the managing of our perception of the whole thing, mentally a psyop. So let's get real about the whole thing and let them know that we're on the same page with them. So part of this, I would like people, if they are on Twitter, to respectfully, when people like Burchett and Gillibrand.
Do you spell that? Because everybody's laughing.
Oh, it's Burchett. It's in Burchett. Yeah, that's good. I have to say, you know, Burchett also, he strikes me as the kind of guy who's just in it. Like, this guy has no interest in UFOs at all. Like, they've literally told him, hey, just stay in it for the gravy train, partner. And, you know, when you look at the way that they're acting with this, everyone who's concerned about it, just go right into their Twitter feed when they come out and they say, I'm trying to get those files from Americans from that damn government for you on UFOs. Well, go right into their Twitter feed and say, what got you interested? When did this start? Did your parents have a sighting? Like, is this a family thing? When did you exactly hear about UFOs for the first time? Was it a book? Tell us the story. Put them all on the spot, respectfully. And, you know, do it with the hashtag UFO, because we all want to read when these congressmen had this come to Jesus moment about UFOs. I would love to know. So I've started the ball rolling. So there you go. This other thing I found interesting, you know, if you're kind of someone with a journalism background, like I've had at times, I've learned little tricks for what goes on in the back room of different newspapers. And one of the things, if you are in the New York Times, of which I've known New York Times reporters, and you're in the back room and they tell you there's a big story coming out, one of the things we need you to do is write teaching points for a school curriculum. That's how important the story is going to be. Those are the high profile, like top of the line stories. And what happens is they'll put a teaching profile on the website that you can sign in as a teacher and get the points to explain it to your classroom or whatever. Now, I found this out, which I found very interesting. I did not know this before, and I don't think anyone has brought it to the fore, but the New York Times did this with the TTSA phony story about Elizondo and, you know, the Tic Tac video and all that. They did it in 2017. Here it is, New York Times. Teaching activities for glowing auras and black money, the Pentagon's mysterious UFO program. The date is 2 days after the story hit. And so they were ready with this. It was not just, oh, we're going to put out a story and see what happens. They were already ready with school curriculums for this. And let's listen to some of the lessons here for a moment, understanding the kind of money and CIA power behind the To the Stars Academy and Elizondo and Mellon and the whole gang. Okay. All right. Shannon Doyne, Doyne. Someone asked her to prepare teaching activities. Here we go. Watch the video. Look at that thing. U.S. Navy jet encounters unknown object. Possible questions. What do the pilots say they are seeing? These are questions for students now. What does the object look like? What do you think it is? What do you think this footage from 2004 was released? Or why do you think this footage from 2004 was released just a few days ago? Now read the article, Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program, and answer the following questions. What was the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program? By the way, a program that as a program did not exist, except in Elizondo's hobby imagination, okay? The actual program is called OSAP. That's the one that got $22 million. This thing is some weird activity that he dreamed up and nicknamed ATIP, okay? It doesn't have anything to do with anything. But the guys who investigate this stuff, like Knapp and Dolan and all that, they don't care about that because ATIP, that word, got them in the news. So they were just interested in that. Who is Robert Bigelow? What did he tell CBS's 60 Minutes? Who is Harry Reid? How is he involved in the airspace program? And on the curriculum goes for your students, kids. So the teacher laying out there talking points from the New York Times, how to teach the TTSA UFO black money story to children in school or students, maybe teenagers. But still, you can see the kind of influence going on here. You know, in a normal story like the FBI raid or whatever, I don't think they're going to prepare teaching points or in stories about the election. When they get stories of this nature, you're instructed by the publisher that there's a strata of stories to go to that you're going to supply for educational purposes. So you need to lay it out as a curriculum format. They did that for the TTSA story, which makes the whole thing a lot more suspicious for me. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program, diving off deep tonight into the mystery schools and taking you with us. Now, we're going to put ourselves in that mindset of understanding back there, these schools and the movements that they brought forward and what they were projecting for us here right now. I did mention we're going to take your questions in part 2, and we're going to do that tonight. And the ideas room is looking good. I have to say the questions are rolling. Miss Olivia?
You caught me, but I'm really busy.
You're busy.
I'm busy. I'm busy thanking everyone for their
Okay.
super chats.
That's good. Well, it's good to have a busy night in the ideas room. So I think that's enough. You want to just call it a night? It's been too busy. Right? All right. Here's some interesting tidbits that, you know, it's fascinating. I was looking for that. Oh, where is it now? It's very close by, I'm sure. There's some interesting images and also some very interesting Casey readings given about the Great White Brotherhood that go into the nature of what we're talking about here, but also mention some other facts which get us thinking around. So before we just get into, you know, who's in the Great White Brotherhood and all that, I think we have a pretty good enough background. Let's get some of these questions that were being asked now of Casey. This is in 1941, so World War II is looming. And they're asking Casey, okay, you know, these masters are starting to speak through him, and they're asking, what's the source that you're speaking from? So this is the answer. From the heights of those experiences, those hierarchies in the earth and in the air, we come as messengers of truth to those who will hear and question. This is the source speaking through Edgar Casey. Question: for the better and more rational presentation of the work of Edgar Casey to the world, will you, if you consider the same, kindly inform us of your identity and the source or sources from which you bring us the information? The Casey source interrupted them. From universal forces that are acceptable and accessible to those that in earnestness open their minds, their souls to the wonderful words of truth and light. It's available there, they're suggesting, for anyone. In this case, Casey had a talent of bringing this forward. Okay, so they roll on to the questions. To what extent are the masters of the Great White Brotherhood directing the activities of Edgar Casey? Who are the masters directly in charge? A question like that just came up. Messengers from the higher forces that may manifest from the throne of grace itself. We're getting very spiritual, religious language there. Who are the masters directly in charge? Is Saint Germain among? And as they go to say it, he interrupts them again. Those that are directed by the Lord of Lords, him that came that you might be one with the Father. So he's going into this Christian imagery. Is Saint Germain among them? Who is Hilaliel? These are all but messengers of the Most High. Hilaliel is the one who from the beginning has been a leader of the heavenly host, who has defied Ariel, who has made the ways that have been a channel of approach to the throne. You make of same often a laughingstock to the very soul through your own selfishness. So then he gives some advice here about just be gentle, just be kind, don't find fault, and basically giving them advice about how to uplift their own arrangement, because apparently the people who were asking the questions were part of the ARE group, and they were having some fights themselves. So bringing through the spiritual energy when you're tense, that energy is like, look, I'm picking up a lot of tension here. And then they say, would the plans of the masters be best served at this time by the initiation of steps by Mr. Casey and those assisting him for the establishment of a foundation for the work of the masters? And then the answer is, when the day of the earth be earthy is fulfilled in him, this body, Casey, he shall be rejuvenated, shall be purged, shall be made free. Then they that in their earthly manners work, labor here and there, and are directed and guided as to the means and manners, the ways that they may, as individuals, as souls, be a helpmeet and an aid to their portion of the service to the great brotherhood of man that is in him. And he gives them some more advice here, but I'm going to skip ahead. And they're asking him, how should we name the foundation and, get some of these basic parts together? And he's giving them answers. And then, at a certain point, they're basically looking for practical advice. Now, interestingly enough, the questions around the Great White Brotherhood continue later. Someone from this group asks Casey a question and says, have I at any time contacted one of the masters or members of the Great White Brotherhood? And Casey answers, you were part of the Great White Brotherhood yourself in Ohum Og, which is the South American version of Atlantis. So here he's suggesting this person is now reincarnated through a series of lives and come back, was actually part of the Great White Brotherhood. That's where the interest this time around comes from. How long has this Great White Brotherhood been operational? I want to point out too that, and it should be obvious because I've talked about them before, but Great White Brotherhood is speaking to the spiritual dimension of their accomplishment. So they've achieved in their aura this kind of white purity. It has nothing to do, there's no racial connotation with white. And, you can imagine the way that things are talked about now, that simple kind of subtle things like that just go over, it's the kind of thing that the media just runs down the ball field with. But it's important, I think, to point out too. So we're going to continue with this. Will I establish contact with the Great White Brotherhood of my Atlantean experience? And the answer is, with the deeper seeking, the deeper meditations, we find that these may be brought about as assurances and are well. They're being like, look, instead of just running your whole life over a cliff and thinking, I was a member of the Great White Brotherhood, it's just, if you're assured of the fact at your own meditation, that's enough. Then you move on. And I do know these people who over and over again, and I love this type of person as well, don't get me wrong, but they will tell me who they were in a past life over and over again, and that they just kind of locked into it. And I think that's one of these things we trip up on, because one, it's very hard to confirm, and two, it can mess up this life. And in a certain level, it kind of doesn't matter. because, it's all about accomplishment going forward. So I think we've all run into the type on this, and that's one of those things I think is easier to just leave behind. But check this one out. Is Virginia Beach to be safe with the upcoming Earth changes? Casey predicts all these Earth changes coming in the 21st century. And he answers this. It is the center and only seaport and center of the Great White Brotherhood. So that's interesting. Virginia Beach is the only seaport and center of the Great White Brotherhood, according to Casey, which I guess is why he's there. There's a lot of questions that come up there because this brotherhood obviously does a great deal that pertains to the physical world and can operate in the etheric and astral realms as well. Virginia is damn close to DC, I would say. Virginia Beach, I don't think that that's very far, having been there before. I'd say it's just a couple hours away. So those things strike me as interesting, especially when we look at the founding of America and the deep associations of the mystery schools with that. This idea that Virginia Beach, which is where the Casey Foundation is, that place is a center of the Great White Brotherhood, says a lot about what Casey was doing, putting it there. If you look at a lot of the early pictures of the period when Casey was doing this, Virginia Beach was like a fishing village. There was nothing there in the 1930s. And for him to go there at that foresight and have it become a major port and all the rest, I think speaks a lot to his abilities. Yes.
Okay, Shamanist Anam Kara says, maybe they had to be in Virginia to offset the CIA.
That's
Brilliant.
True. Well, that's interesting
There's
to think
a
of
lot
that.
of darkness there.
That's a dark group. But also, having been there in that environment, there's a couple of things I know for sure. One, the action of water apparently affects psychic people. And I think there are some readings where they suggest this for Casey, that he's going to find his best kind of opportunity to use that ability near water, large bodies of water. And two, apparently in Virginia Beach, there's a large amount of gold in the sand, and that people would lie on that beach for purposes of curing their arthritis because they found that in the readings. There's a lot of interesting things as well about the ARE, and I know they're going through some changes, and they're getting, there's some things about the leadership and stuff that people don't like right now. But fundamentally, I mean, they've been there really since Casey's death. And so what is that, 1945? So that, trying to operate this thing over the course of 75, 80 years, they've served a great purpose. And, they'll have ups and downs and periods where things are stale or whatever. But ultimately, I think on balance, they've done a lot of very good work. So I think that this gives us some idea that there's something more going on here with the association of Casey and Virginia Beach. And then we have the Great White Brotherhood. Now, I may have mentioned this story about this turban figure who followed Casey around at key moments in his life. And a turban figure around Casey who's living in like Virginia, Kentucky, Alabama, this is not a typical kind of thing that you're going to see in those states at that time. So he is an unusual figure. And one of the times that he shows up in is when Casey's father and Dr. Ketchum, and Dr. Ketchum is someone who brought Casey's work out to a mass audience through an article in the New York Times, and by testing Casey's medical abilities, psychic diagnostic abilities. So one of the things that he does is he has a series of doctors observe these readings. And very often, we find that the doctors in this case were pretty rude with Casey, and they didn't believe he was in a trance. And one of them, to prove it, stuck a pin in Casey's hand, to which he didn't react at all. But the reading stopped. And then afterwards he was furious, But it's very interesting because when they get back after this trip, the father and Ketchum are doing these readings with Casey, and they'll give a normal reading, and then at the end of the reading, they'll sneak in things relating to horse races or the lottery, or things of this nature. And Casey doesn't realize it because normally either his wife or his secretary Gladys is doing the readings. So these guys are basically, creating a whole financial thing for themselves using his psychic ability. And he's walking around with intense migraines to the point where he can't even do work as a psychic or a photographer. And so he's in his photography office one day, and a figure comes in who is dressed kind of like an Indian Raja. And he has the turban on and very piercing eyes. He walks up to Casey and says, "You with the wrong people." And doesn't say anything else, walks out. Casey flips out. He's like, "Who is this guy?" And he runs out there and he asks the receptionist, "Did you see where that guy went?" And they're like, "We didn't see anybody." Then they wonder what's going on with Casey. So, there are times when this guy shows up where apparently other people can't see him, but he seems to be a regular master guiding the work of Casey. As we know, Casey's work heavily influenced by the Rosicrucians and the mystery schools as the next wave of how they're going to do things. Just like the Western initiators had tried it with Blavatsky. And I think at a certain point when they withdraw from Blavatsky, they're thinking, we're going to do this other thing down the road a few decades. And Casey was the recipient of that. There's another very interesting story about when, Casey does these readings and he's put on trial for practicing medicine without a license. This is really the lowest point where he thinks about just junking the whole thing, getting rid of, being a psychic, because he was a very successful photographer and didn't need it. And at that point, he's walking down the street. He's gone back to New York to fulfill a few things with publishing obligations. And he sees the same Indian guide. And this time, the Indian guide bows before him. And there's a crowd that starts to gather around them. Everyone's looking at this weird scene. But there is, this ascended master then bowing before Casey. And we're getting this impression then that for all his sacrifice, the things that he's gone through, that he has had to put up with by trying to be of service, and even going to jail for practicing medicine without a license and, being set up. Here is an ascended master saying, you know what? You have learned the great lesson, which is this stuff isn't easy. And I now am bowing to you for accomplishing this. So people who reported on that when it happened said that Casey had to be pulled out of the scene because such a huge crowd had gathered. In this case, the Indian guide had actually manifested himself. He was physically visible and everyone saw him. So the nature of the story there, I think, is very instructive, that it is, it's an active agency, invisible agency, working alongside these people. And on that level, it can feel very lonely. And I'm sure with the kind of financial problems and with the difficulties that Casey faced, that this is, one of those reassurances from a higher realm that just is life changing, and probably gave him the courage and the strength on that to go on. Yes.
Will you share for a minute what Casey did when he was in jail?
Yeah, that's a very interesting story too. He basically, with some rowdy prisoners, gave them spontaneous psychic readings and told them about why they were in there and stuff. And those people subsequently wrote to him for years. So it is interesting, someone who can take even jail and turn it around into an uplifting experience. It makes you wonder quite a bit. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep here, and we're looking at the Great White Brotherhood and their influence on a day-to-day level and on a deeper level. And in our own period of time versus this eighth sphere, transhumanist chip in your brain consciousness, which we see coming forward, and really has foundations in so much of the left-hand path occult work through figures like Aleister Crowley and so on. But that, I think, has grown even beyond the types of things that Crowley was envisioning for it. And I think that these people, under And again, that's anthroposophy, but under that Ahrimanic influence, they're falling into this technological zone of the eighth sphere, and that is a virtual reality realm of which there is no return. So this is the nature of the period that we're in. And the eighth sphere is going to come up. Of course, we've mentioned this in shows before. It's very interesting to talk about it in relation to how the brotherhoods are in opposition. And we're going to get to some of those quotes tonight as well. Before I move along, Miss Olivia, what you got?
I didn't know that he actually gave psychic readings to the prisoners. What
Yeah.
I recalled is that him being a Sunday school teacher, he started talking about God and his faith and lessons from the Bible, and they all surrounded him and quieted down like little children at his feet. And
yeah, that's I think that's an aspect of that. Well, he's in jail for 3 days. So, but what's interesting, that's pretty fascinating. He had that ability to do that. Apparently, he had a remarkably charismatic presence when speaking, which is interesting. But I would say this also about Casey, which is, and some of the recounting of that, and it was Harmon Bro who gave a really great elucidation of this whole thing. One of the things that he said was that, Casey had psychically picked up on why some of those people were there and was giving them, the benefit of like, hey, turn your life around while you can, kind of thing. So a little tough love from the psychic realm.
I think it's wonderful. I mean, how lucky were they to have Casey for 3 days locked up with them? What an incredible blessing.
That would make quite a reality series, right? 3 days in jail.
Speaking of, I can't believe they still haven't really made a Casey biopic or series. I mean, it's insane at this stage.
That is very interesting. Let's face it. And
they don't want the information out there.
What's interesting is, who's the guy who's high fidelity again?
John Cusack.
John Cusack apparently was interested in Edgar Casey's story and pitched a version of it called The Source. And there was a write-up about it in 2014 that this thing was going to happen and never did. And, it's interesting to me because there's another story of a movie that got squashed, which was De Niro playing Carlos Marcello, and that was all about the JFK assassination. Apparently, that one was too hot to handle. But it's interesting to hear these things floated out there and then they don't happen. But in particular, with the Casey story, unreal. I mean, we're at an interesting point where his story, I think, would be compelling to anyone.
Yeah, Juji says there is a resistance to esoteric Christianity.
There's no question about it. And here's an interesting thing, though. Gigi just did a very important lecture, which is 3 hours. That's available on YouTube, and that's on her Gigi Young channel, on Ahriman and Steiner's version of Lucifer and Christ. This is a must listen. So make sure that you're on board with that, because it opens these things up. You have to remember, when I go after this stuff, it's in the realm of journalism. I think that Gigi Young does a wonderful thing with, being able to go in on that. So she's coming from the mystical side as well. She just opens it up, and it's quite an experience. So make sure you treat yourself to that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is episode X series 134, going deep here tonight on the Great White Brotherhood. Let's keep rolling, shall we? How are we doing on time here? So we'll take your questions in about a half hour. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right, fantastic. Let's see if I can get through all of this. Okay. Bernard Picard. You pick up this name? It's an artist. Bernard Picard. Well, I was always fascinated by this guy's work on Ezekiel's wheel. And there's a thing about Ezekiel's wheel that makes me wonder about technology in Atlantis and the various things that are involved with the development of the story that the mystery schools kept through the Egyptian periods and through Pythagoras and into the Middle Ages and so forth. But Picard was this very unusual 17th century artist, and he did a wonderful drawing of Ezekiel's wheel. Let's see. Yes. Okay, I've done it here. That's the picture, and it's an easy one to look up if you can't see all the particulars there, but just to get that general thing. And that's Ezekiel seeing this miraculous thing that shows up before him in the desert. Now, in the Bible, it's taken as, he's a very in tune religious prophet, and it's taken as a sign of his, this is one of his visions. A lot of people who are on that Ancient Aliens kind of side, their von Däniken piece, have seen it as a remarkable version of an early ET encounter, which it does resemble. There's no question about it. But that's, of course, looking through too narrow a lens if you consider the fact that Atlantis had advanced technology and these things of that nature. We have to kind of look at it a little bit differently. To just call everything a UFO experience doesn't make sense either, although it's a nice breakthrough to look at some of these things that way. Well, interestingly enough, there were questions that were put to Casey about Atlantis and the technology they had. And we've covered them here about the kind of X technology that they had, which was remarkable and run by this two-eye stone. But he said that they had craft that could fly at these incredible speeds and could actually go through mountains and things like that and fly underwater. So they were an incredibly advanced civilization that destroyed themselves, and we had forgotten all about that and came back as a culture and have this weird memory in the back of our head that, hey, we did all this before. So a kind of a collective unconscious deja vu, let's say. So now there's a lot of weird things about this vision that really you can find echoes of in the Casey readings about Atlantis. But one of the weird things is when they put to Casey about the Atlantean technology, he says, they say, what kind of ships were they like? Can you describe them for us? And he says, oh, that's easy. Basically, they're very much like the ships that Ezekiel described, but this was a much later date. So what Casey's suggesting there, and why I think that's such an earthquake, is that he's saying basically someone else kept the technology from the Atlantean period. And that's what Ezekiel is seeing. But this is more like 3000 BC instead of 10,000 BC. So who was it who kept it in between? This becomes the question. Now, let's read a few things about the Ezekiel vision, keeping it in mind that he sees these wheels within a wheel, this incredible roar, this incredible ship that comes down, and he thinks he sees someone sitting on a throne, and he interprets it all religiously, which makes sense. But we can also look at it through the lens that this is Atlantean technology and a leftover Atlantean splinter group. Think about this. Here's the vision. As the cloud comes nearer, Ezekiel is able to distinguish 4 creatures, living beings. In Yiddish, they have a term called wilde kais, which is wild animals. And that's the translation from Hebrew is actually that the things were wild animals. Each of these vaguely human creatures has 4 faces and 4 wings, as well as a single rigid leg whose foot ends in a calf's hoof. Now, it's going to be interesting when we think about this because the Casey readings talk about these Atlantean hybrids that they bring into Egypt with them. And those hybrids sometimes are crossed. They are basically Atlantean cyborgs, but they are crossed with animals. And so you get a chimerical appearance. Although their feet are animal shaped, their hands, which are visible under their wings, are anthropomorphic. Following a notice that the creatures did not need to turn when they faced in a new direction, their 4 faces corresponding to the 4 points of the compass are described. A human face in front, that of a lion on the right, an ox on the left, and an eagle on the back. Ezekiel looked, and a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north, a huge cloud, flashing fire surrounded by a radiance, and in the center of it, the center of the fire, a gleam of amber. Now let's listen close with the KC Atlantean technology in mind. Above the heads of the creatures was a form, an expanse with an awe-inspiring gleam as of crystal, was spread out above their heads. Under the expanse, each one had a pair of wings that extended towards those of the others, and each had another pair covering its body. When they moved, I could hear the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters. This thing has a really loud engine. And above the expanse over their heads was the semblance of a throne in appearance like sapphire, and on top the semblance of a throne was the semblance of a human form. Now this could be someone at the controls. He's sitting there at the controls. I'll use the kind of Von Daniken thing where he's like, hey, the mind is on a spaceship. Remember that one? So this is the same type of thing, but forget about aliens for a minute. We're just talking about the Atlantean tech. I looked up, and on the expanse over the heads of the cherubs, there was something like sapphire stone. An appearance resembling a throne could be seen over them. So he's seeing crystals, sapphires, hybrids. As I gazed on the creatures, I saw one wheel on the ground next to each other in the four-faced creatures. As for the appearance of the wheels, they gleamed like beryl. All four had the same form. The appearance of the structure of each was as of two wheels cutting through each other. And that, again, is that very interesting picture by Picard. Picard, by the way, was very aware of how the mystery schools kept. If you look through his paintings, I found some very interesting versions of his paintings. I'm going to show you one which is all about, in Greek mythology, the killing of a giant underneath a volcano. And Enceladus. This is interesting because hopefully I drew the close-up, but this is the actual picture of it. Same artist now. If you can get just a look at that. And what's happening is you have these unusual riders in the sky that are shooting this X technology directly at the volcano. And I'll see if I have the close-up of that. I'm pretty sure I printed it out. And then you can see this giant figure hiding underneath the volcano. I'll just give you a quick look at that. I'll tweet this one out when the show's over. But Picard, there's something really weird going on with Picard. And it's not just the Ezekiel pictures, but this guy knows what's going on. So let's think about this for a moment, because, Gigi actually put an idea in my mind, and we're going to explore it in an episode. But some of the conversation around Casey's work and the Atlantean cyborg things, the untouchables, as he called them, that they brought into Egypt, and some of them were misshapen, and some of them, there was a great debate about how to make them human. So we're looking at that with the whole transhumanist move as well. Not only that, but there's a big piece in here about these pre-Adamite races being in one sex. And we see also a move to get rid of the gender aspect. So we might be looking here at the infiltration of the left-hand side of the schools, bringing into that kind of World Economic Forum and the kind of, Lockheed Martin, Microsoft combination of technology, might is right, and sort of splintering off dimensions of humanity into these groups that, can serve a purpose one way or another, but won't live out a life as a human being. This is where they're heading with it. And if we understand the esoteric roots from where it's coming from, which the schools left us glaringly public evidence for, in the case of Isis Unveiled, in the case of Knowledge of Higher Worlds, these books are unusual. They're very strange if you look at them. They're strange, out of time, not of place, and looking back at them is strange. So there's a higher level of knowledge that they're operating from. And so now here we are on the receiving end of this, and we've learned now there have been generations that have had those books, lived and died, and passed them on. So now here we are 100 years after that whole movement, and how have we observed and absorbed the lesson of that? That's where we're going next. And speaking of Ascended Masters, that is that wonderful shot of Blavatsky with the Masters, that artist, impression, theosophical artist there. And that, fundamentally, again, Blavatsky's life changed when she encountered this master who apparently had been following her whole life, because she'd been psychic since she was a child. and compelled to go around the world and leave Russia and start her own life, basically. And she went to Egypt, she went to Tibet, and all these remarkable places, and then ended up in 1875 founding the Theosophical Society with Alcott. And that's where all these different things happen. I say a lot of things about Theosophy, but here's just a few stats. They brought over yoga to America. They brought the first cremation to America. All these things that are in the zeitgeist, that understanding of reincarnation, all this comes from that foundational piece of Theosophy. And if you think about the incredible after effects of the whole thing, and the fact that guys like Edison and Gandhi and just remarkable list of names were Theosophical members, tells us a great deal about the impact that they were having in the public and, of course, behind the scenes as well. Politically, philosophically, spiritually, this is a group that really set the stage for so many things. And when you get and graduate from that point to Steiner's anthroposophy, what do you get? You get biodynamic farming, you get eurythmy, you get Waldorf schools. I mean, this is the mystery schools having that, moving the culture in the background without sort of taking the culture and hitting it over the head and saying, look, you need to do this and do that and do this. No, they're just moving things in the background for those who can see it and dial into it. I think that's the crucial piece. All right, a little more. By the way, I love that X steganography, just for you X fans. That is the papal logo, okay? It's two keys that make an X. I think that tells us a great deal indeed. All right, let's keep rolling. I promised you that with Picard, I would show you the close-up of that X. Are you ready, everyone? Take a real good look at the symbol of the X given in relation to these lightning bolts that are being thrown to attack the giant in the Greek myth. This is very interesting, and I think, again, is that hint of that Atlantean technology, which was hidden through that X steganography, through the mystery schools, and then showed up in the 20th century as the great denominator of the UFO file and the secrecy program moving through various government agencies as a result. Very interesting indeed. But that is Bernard Picard. Very, very interesting artwork if you're looking at those myths. Okay. Next up, we're going to take a look here at how this all spins out in relation to the eighth sphere piece. The eighth sphere is unique in that it was already let out of the bag by Steiner, and I've pointed this out, that there was a really intense war behind the scenes about how this got out. But now that it's out and we're talking about it, this is crucial, because I would say between the work we do on this program and the shows on it that Gigi Young has done, it's much more in the zeitgeist, and you hear it a lot more. We've done shows with Alana Freeland on it, who, of course, into understanding geoengineering and doing that great background. She was a Steiner teacher, so she understands these concepts right in her back pocket. Therefore, that exchange from the X series through Gigi's work, Alana Freeland, now there's a conversation about the eighth sphere. Although Steiner had brought it to the fore 100 years ago, I can tell you that before we had put it out there, there wasn't a lot of talk going on about the eighth sphere. It was pretty much Ahriman and the eighth sphere were just obscure things. It's not to give us a pat on the back, it's to say that the zeitgeist is ready, because the ideas room itself picking up on it to the level that we are, and how we can use it, and how it's a navigator for this period of time. It helps our understanding a great deal, to understand what the process is and what the transhumanism is all about. And this is so crucial. It puts us on the same level as the people who are attempting to harvest humanity. That's crucial. And it gives us that extra piece. But without any further ado, what does Mr. Steiner have to say about this? Well, I pointed this out before, that Steiner fundamentally gave us decades of his life, in my opinion, telling us exactly about this Ahrimanic piece. Ahriman, that's his sculpture of Ahriman there. And this is his impression of Ahriman's nature, who he considers the devil. But the Ahrimanic force, being dark astral force, manifests through, in the 21st century, technology. And the buildup through the 20th century was an Ahrimanic wave. In a nutshell, the term comes from Persian mythology, and it goes into a deep mythology, be it Ahriman and his twin, and the twin is Christ-like, and they do battle nonstop. Ahrimanic forces deeply involved in ideas of cloning, ideas of merging man with machine, ideas of putting chips in your brain, like Klaus Schwab drools at the prospect. And even people who claim to be liberated, like SpaceX founder Elon Musk, is just all about, inserting these electrodes in your head and seeing what he can do. So much for that. And when I look at that, they always sneak in the idea that, oh, this will be, it'll have such revolutionary uses. Someone who is paralyzed can use their muscles. That's not what they're about. They're not doing it as just a separate science medical program. They want to extend this thing out. And there is a good reason for the culture to be absolutely paranoid in relation to that. That's not paranoia, that's clear thinking, because where those people are going with that, just think about what they polled with the recent piece and how there's so many unanswered questions about that. And all those companies that contributed to all this, all the money has flown to the top, the Amazons, the Pfizers, SpaceX, and all those people have gone through the roof, and regular people have been cleaned out. It's pretty obvious what's going on. And it's very important, just like we see the political ping pong game moving forward, where the Biden administration is punishing and legally trying to entrap, they just did 40 different subpoenas now relating to their political opponents on the Trump side. It doesn't matter where you fall politically on this. This is dangerous. These people are extremely dangerous. And I think in the Biden administration, they're in such a desperate state because they're hanging on to the fact that the media won't crucify them because they have a terrible economy and a terrible foreign policy and some of the worst people in government we've ever seen in our lives. But we're in the middle of this situation where it's a highly Ahrimanic situation. What they just signed and came forward with was their approval for this central bank digital currency. And this is something we did a series of shows with Catherine Austin Fitts over the last year on. Let me tell you something. If they get the central bank digital currency, and if we adopt that as a digital wallet, that's the end of freedom. There is no more freedom, because as Fitts has described to us so well, and at the BIS, actually, they've gone on the record and said this, if you say something the government doesn't like, that's it. You don't buy gas, or you don't charge your electric car. And if they don't want you to buy pizza, you don't buy pizza. It's that simple. So the CBDC is the end of freedom, and therefore must be resisted 100% politically, legally, and through protest, and also through using cash. As we know, it's highly annoying to the powers that be on the financial digital train. So let's make sure that we do that. But this is the nature of where things are. So the stage that we're in is highly Ahrimanic, and the Ahrimanic control grid involved with developing weapons in space and controlling the ground from space, which is a great goal of the Nazis. And, we took on a lot of those guys, of course, for our own space program, as we've done so many shows with Dr. Farrell on. And what you get is that Nazi mindset, like it or not, starts to spread inside of the space program. And there we are. So 75 years after the CIA was founded with the help of General Galen, an ex-Nazi, then all of a sudden here we are up to our necks in this space fusion of totalitarian fascism from on high coming on the ground. And then they want to track your transactions. And oh, by the way, biometrics are now something that Biden just signs off on. There's no congressional hassle. And the fact that the idea that they're going to use biometrics and going to basically integrate humans with machines is just the stroke of a presidential pen. The problem is Stepford Biden isn't even up there. So who's signing this stuff for him? That has to be the next question. So we're in a very perilous phase, and it's my personal belief that the work of the mystery schools was left as a guidepost for the particular types of perils that we're in. And strangely enough, the mythology and the cosmology involved that they're bringing to the fore becomes very real. So when we're speaking about Ahriman, yes, it's part of the cosmology that Steiner is presenting as the outline of his spiritual science philosophy. But if you can see it through, the idea of the eighth sphere becomes very real when you're looking at the powers of the internet, the powers of metaverse, sucking people in through this virtual reality trap. That's the reality on the ground. So they have the ability, they've taken us into the unreal stage. And so therefore, we're in a stage where we can start to see, oh, this Ahrimanic piece and all that. On that level, we can understand it as a literal interaction. And whether you accept the Steiner work or reincarnation or theosophy or anything like of that nature, you can see very clearly that we're in a phase where the technology is at a very dangerous stage. And I say that as somebody, again, who's been a tech editor, and I really know tech real well. And I don't have any misgivings about the technology except for the fact of how it's being used. So the idea of technology freeing people is fascinating. I remember a story my dad used to tell me about when he was growing up. And when he was in the military and things, they were always saying, hey, look, the technology is going to be great. No one's going to have to work anymore. Like, they can free themselves on to other things. Now they're just talking about, hey, we're going to get rid of your job, and, we'll stick you at home, and you can be locked down, and maybe we'll give you a UBI, a little stipend here once in a while. But after a while, you'll just be non-productive citizen. And hey, guess what? There's like a COVID camp over here. We're going to stick you in. I mean, this is the nature of how people think on that psychotic level. And it's largely driven by corporate greed and political corruption. So the backdrop against this kind of spiritual revolution and the understanding that is being brought forward in the period that we're in, this is it. This is really it. And, before they pull the next COVID op out of their pocket, in my opinion, either a phony cyber systems threat, cyber hack, worldwide cyber hack, or the UFO threat, which is coming one way or another. Before they get there, it would be very crucial for us to get our heads wrapped around as a society, this whole eighth sphere piece. That's where we're headed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, now you're going deep on it. It's X Series 134. And this is the Great White Brotherhood versus the occult eighth sphere. And those groups on the left-hand path who have gained. And as we understand from Steiner, we're always deeply rooted in the political system in America. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. And Miss Olivia has been pretty patient with I have to say, good, nicely done through all this.
They're keeping me busy.
I have a ton to go through here, but let's see if I can do it all in the next 15 minutes, and then we're up.
I'm going to interrupt you and actually go straight to, I'm going to cut to the chase. So spirituality is about faith over fear, right? So could you talk for a minute? Shamanist Anam gave a Steiner quote on fear. Quote, "We must eradicate root and branch any fear and dread in our soul concerning the future that is coming towards us. We must develop composure with regard to all the feelings and sensations we have about the future. We must anticipate with absolute equanimity whatever may be coming towards us, thinking only that whatever it may be will be brought to us by the wisdom-filled guidance of the universe."
Yeah, well, it's a lofty position Steiner's putting out there. He's saying, I'm going to lay this out. I'm going to tell you like it is. Unlike theosophy, which basically was like, hey, don't worry about it. We're going into the sixth root race. The world teacher's coming, and the sixth root race all have psychic abilities. So the world's going to understand each other better. Don't worry. Everything's going to be peachy keen. Steiner's the same way, except he says, oh yeah, wait a minute. There's the war of all against all, and there's this technology god coming through. You're going to have to all do battle with. And they're trying to suck you all into the eighth sphere. It's a little bit different. It's like straight talk. But what he's saying is we don't flee from that, and that it's not a fear porn thing. Like we always see this stuff. Oh, the sun is going to let off a discharge. And it's important to know about these things. Don't get me wrong. I don't think we study the sun closely enough. And I think on the independent side, we should. But there's also always connecting it with some impending disaster. So if we project for that impending disaster, it's a bad, it's a bad deal for us because we help create it. There's no question about it. But at the same time, what Steiner is saying here is like, look, if you have the ability and the awareness for when this stuff is coming in, then it doesn't matter how it comes in because your awareness is going to guide you with it. So I think that that's a key thing. And too often the mainstream media is pulling your chain, trying to scare you all the time. Oh, there's going to be a food shortage. A lot of these shortages are just things they're creating in order to create the idea of a climate crisis. And again, it's the exploiting of legitimate issues, because I think on the alternative side, we don't stand up enough for the idea that there are environmental problems caused by nuclear testing, for example. What kind of damage did that do to the stratosphere? All the different things that we've done with fracking and all the rest of it. You want to think there's no political, environmental damage rather from that? Absolutely. There is. So, we don't have to hang out on the alternative side and say, oh, they're lying about everything. No, we can say, look, you guys have destroyed the environment and you sold that to us. And now you want us to pay for it. And you also want us to suffer for it. I'll tell you what, Jeff Bezos, with your $200 billion, we'll take a 10% of your income. We'll take 10% of Musk, and we'll take 10% of all those other guys who benefited the most from this, who keep their money in offshore accounts and don't reinvest that money in America. And we'll have you guys pay for the cleanup. That's okay. I'm big on you want green stuff? Good. Bring it on. You can pay for it. We'll see how quickly they shut up about it, because that's just another system they're bringing on where they are at the top already. They've already assigned themselves into the various categories. They've already created the ESGs and all the rest of it. So it's not that people on the alternative side should say, oh, there aren't any greenhouse gases and there's no damage to the environment and forget about it. No, it's just that their phony solutions about electric cars and, Elon Musk saying electric cars are the way to save the environment is complete BS, because in order just to make those electric cars, they'd have to decimate the entire environment. That's what they're engaged in, but they want to be in charge of that economy too. And they're not converting it into a breakthrough energy. Tesla was working in 1912, on energy that was wirelessly beamed. You tell me that in over 100 years, they haven't progressed on that? Complete BS. Of course they can do it. So, let's just all get real. And the idea that, oh, we have emergencies and the climate emergencies are next, that gives us emergency powers, and your little peon, stay in your house and don't try to advance yourself. It's not going to work. There's too many of us. We're too loud. So the only thing that they can do is create the biggest emergency. And I think that's the thing that they're planning for. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. What else you got?
You want me to go for it?
Sure.
Karen Carpenter, this is my best question. Are we the Christ returned?
Well, we're in the Christ returned if we want to be, right? That's the point. So that would be my answer for that. I mean, every person answers that in their own way. I always like to say that from a spiritual point of view, each person understands their own connection with that. So I'd never pretend to project that on them. But I would say that, if you understand the Christian aspect in studying the mysteries, the Christian part is kind of the apex of the Western mystery tradition. So therefore, you understand that the whole setup of what they were doing in creating a better human being on the mystery side with the school of the prophets and the preparation for Christ was to bring through the Christ as the pattern through the man Jesus. So that is, in a traditional Christian sense, they understand Christ in one particular way, and they get all the fundamentals in that. On the esoteric Christian piece, Casey has Christ having some 30 lives evolving into Jesus, who can then carry the Christ who comes in from age 30 to age 33, you know, and saves humanity through the mystery of Golgotha. This whole piece is very interesting because it gets into what the mystery schools teach about Christ. And not only that, but the Casey reading suggests that Adam was the first incarnation of Christ. So we also have Emilius as Adam, and Emilius being the first being that comes in and creates in Atlantis some order out of the chaos. And this Emilius is the priesthood that creates the two-eyed stone and the benevolent use of technology and things like that in Atlantis. That's the Casey story. But, you know, if you think about it, it runs deep. And the idea that the Belial group sneaks in there and sort of extorts the Emilius group and then uses the technology to, you know, nuke their neighbors and things like that. That's kind of an echo, which when we look around in the world today, we can easily see that this is how things go, as much as we'd like to project them to go differently and have a more kind of benevolent viewpoint on the world. We see this is pretty, like, look at the Iraq wars and all the various things that we've seen happen, Vietnam and all the rest. This is kind of how things play out, unfortunately. So humanity needs to move on a large scale with that. There's a quote relating directly to this exploiting and the split in Atlantis, which will be reflected in our time in a book called An Outline of Occult Science by Steiner. I'm going to read something that's in there that'll give us some hint of that. Watching X Series 134. This is the Dark Journalist Show. We're coming up to your questions here shortly. Okay. Toward the middle of the Atlantean period of evolution, a great evil gradually began to manifest itself within mankind. The mysteries of the initiates ought to have been carefully guarded from individuals who had not been prepared and were not purified their astral bodies of error through preparation. When such human beings acquire a certain insight into mystery knowledge, into the laws by which the higher beings guide the forces of nature, they then play at the service of their perverted needs and passions. Sound familiar in the 21st century? The danger was all the greater since human beings, as already described, came into the realm of lower spiritual beings who, unable to carry out the regular Earth evolution, acted contrary to it. This is very important because it's talking about two orders of beings here. This is going to be reflected in a quote I read from Blavatsky right after this. These spiritual beings influenced human beings constantly by arousing in them interests that were, in truth, directed against the welfare of mankind, but human beings still had the ability to use the forces of growth and reproduction of animal and human nature for their own purposes. Not only ordinary human beings, but also a number of initiates succumbed to the temptations of lower spiritual beings. They went so far as to use the described supersensible forces in a way that ran counter to the development. Let's see here, of mankind. And for this activity, they sought associates who were not initiated and who, for lower ends, seized upon the mysteries of the supersensible workings of nature. The consequence has a great corruption of mankind. The evil spread further and further. And since the forces of growth and reproduction, when diverted from their natural functions and used independently, stand in a mysterious connection with certain forces that work in air and water, mighty destructive forces were unfettered by human deeds. This led to the gradual destruction of the Atlantean region through terrestrial catastrophes of air and water. Here it's interesting. Steiner's suggesting there's a connection between natural destruction and misuse, misdirection of psychic ability. And this can be in the latent individuals, the ones who are uninitiated, developing very quickly into the psychic piece. Now think about what we started to say about Ahriman giving everyone clairvoyance through the technology. And we start to get a hint that this type of psychic activity, which would come in through technological means and is not the natural opening up of those forces in an individual, this could be very dangerous. And this is the kind of, running over a cliff idea of the World Economic Forum, the progress at any price, the chip in your brain piece. Those are the kind of echoes I get when I read that in Steiner's work. Now, I'm going to read about these pre-Adamites in Blavatsky, and then I'll wrap this section up and we'll go to your questions, say in about 5 minutes. All right. Let's see here. Blavatsky had a thing about Darwinism, that it was completely a devolved and degraded philosophy, and that what it took were fundamental concepts of development and warped them into the human descended from animal thing. Something that Steiner was fond of saying was, what a human being took as the picture of his life and went into the next realm with, say, in the 19th century. They would move directly in the reality they'd become possessed with at death, and moving into that other realm are the pictures that they were developing for themselves on Earth. So if they had imagined themselves as descended from animals, when they went into that other realm, that's basically what they became. So we can see when we play with the belief system of the mind, and keeping in mind that thoughts are things, that it's very important for us to get at the truth of these matters, which is, in my opinion, why the schools risked so much by bringing the truths out at different various periods in history. So she's coming in and saying the Darwinian thing was total BS from a spiritual point of view. And so here's her reasoning on it. And this comes directly from Isis Unveiled. It's Blavatsky again. I have a picture of her here. Again, a remarkable person, much maligned, but who basically opened this whole conversation up. She wasn't perfect, but she brought through that teaching of the masters and really set us up for the whole Steiner works and all the things that Theosophy accomplished. Quite remarkable, if you think about it. Okay. Here she goes. Quote, the whole Darwinian theory of natural selection is included in the first 6 chapters in the book of Genesis. The man of chapter 1 is radically different from the Adam of chapter 2. It's interesting. For the former was created male and female, that is bisexed, and in the image of God, while the latter, according to verse 7, was formed from the dust of the ground and became a living soul after the Lord breathed into his nostril the breath of life. Moreover, this Adam was a male being, and in verse 20 we are told that there was not found a helpmeet for him. The Adonai, being pure spiritual entities, had no sex, or rather had both sexes united in themselves like their creator. 2 streams of humanity here, two streams of consciousness. Back to Blavatsky. The Adonai, being pure spiritual entities, had no sex, or rather had both sexes united in themselves like their creator, and the ancients understood this so well that they represented many of their deities as of dual sex. The biblical student must either accept their interpretation or make the passages in the 2 chapters alluded to absurdly contradict each other. It was such literal acceptance of passages that warranted the atheists in covering the Mosaic account with ridicule, and it is the dead letter of the old text that begets the materialism of our age. The misunderstanding of the 2 races concept. Not only are the 2 races of beings thus clearly indicated in Genesis, but even a 3rd and a 4th are ushered before the reader is in chapter 4, where the sons of gods and the race of giants are spoken of. It's very interesting because it looks like there's interference early on. And one of my things generally about the groups who, kind of like the Schwab transhumanist types, and even the Epstein-Maxwell gang and their recruitment of scientists, et cetera, that this was coming from a place that was very much oriented around the cult of Belial, which was the opposing force to Emilius in Atlantis that Edgar Casey outlined so well. That mad dash to find those ruins in the hot zone off the coast of Cuba and all the way over to Bimini, based on a large-scale program that's been going on since the 1920s about this. We're looking at a group that is obsessed with contact and reigniting this Belial aspect. And then they're aware of the background as laid out from these mystery schools publicly. And if you compare Steiner's comments looking at this and saying, well, this is how it happened in Atlantis, these initiates got polluted, and they're great advancements, because remember what was happening, Steiner said, in Atlantis was these priestesses were being developed and able to interact with these higher realms, and they were dealing with the saintly realm through the development of the 2-eye crystal technology. What happens instead is the Belial group infiltrates the Emilius group, which is a different group, and is coming from a much lower place. And they're like, hey, we're going to use the same technology to decimate the rest of the globe. And then eventually it's that battle between the Emilius group and the Belial group that starts to cause accidents and problems and ultimately disintegrates Atlantis. This is interesting. If we start to consider it as a real echo and a memory of the place that we're in now, and you start to look around and see the developments in the technology moving into what must have been considered almost science fiction in the 1930s. Let's face it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going to take your questions now. I'm going to turn it over to Miss Olivia, and I'll insert. I still have more things here, but I'm just going to throw them in where I can so we keep on some kind of schedule. And Miss Olivia,
I wasn't ready for you yet. Okay. Where do I want to start? Up here. So Everett World wants to know, how can we help children today to break free of Ahrimanic influences? And Feeling Better Naturally says, how to stop the Nazification of our organic reality.
Yeah, well, look, children, I don't have any children, okay? So the mothers and fathers out there are much more educated and aware of bringing up kids. But this much I can say, that the way the technology is being used against children, that one, if there were a way to homeschool them, I certainly would go for that. And two, if there were a way to keep them completely limited around technology, and I mean almost to a draconian place, just highly limited in relation to the technology, and learning the technology in a way of safeguarding themselves from it, as opposed to, to really have the understanding that this isn't something to sort of suck your consciousness into or let your consciousness be sucked out. I think that that's important. And, I feel like between anthroposophies, Waldorf schools, Montessori, and other movements around this, that it's going to be crucial to find a whole different way to educate the young in this country and around the globe. But yeah, wow, does that not get to it?
Yeah, what we need, well, we were talking about this as a parallel society. So they figured this out while they're dismantling the old one, right? The elites have been erecting this other structure that, for decades they've been planning this. So we are late to the game, but that, we have God on our side. So one thing I did want to recommend for everyone is Pam Gregory did the most incredible interview with Catherine McBean. You have to go watch it. It's incredible what's happening. If she is starting to, this woman is the right woman at the right time. And I feel like someday she's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, this is interesting. There's a lot of movements going on. I remember Fitz used to talk a lot about the maker movement, and we're seeing a lot of things spring up. And this is part, I think, of that move into doing things splitting that line from the development of this world and where it's going versus what people should do in relation to creating local systems of food, local systems of money, and things of that nature, and local systems of government. It's going to move in that direction. One of the, I want to be real about it too, because one of the things I got from my conversations, the interviews with RFK Jr. was very interesting because, and we're going to have him back on the show soon. But the interesting thing is that he was saying, look, you can't run for the hills anymore because of the nature of the SpaceX satellites and the domination of the low Earth orbit and these other things. So we have to sort of fight this out and play this out now. And, he was saying go through the court system and really challenge this whole system, one community at a time, whether it's the 5G technology or the satellite technology and its dominance over these various things, just like we saw with the whole trucker thing, when the truckers were standing up in Canada. There were a lot of weird things there because, in a way, I think they were baiting that situation to happen as an idea of convincing business and saying, look, we can replace and automate your truckers with these satellite controlled cars. And that's what the whole Musk thing is about, et cetera. And, could there be like these automatic cars side by side with regular drivers? Sure. But what they do is monopoly. That's the name of their game. And it's incredibly dangerous and also destructive to our economy. So where they're going is a different place than what we're going. So we can, inside these structures, realistically, even though there's no hills to run to, we can start to operate differently inside the same environment as these people. So I would say that would be crucial. Yes.
Lois Mentor says in the 80s, they said that the way to prepare to combat Ahriman after 2000 was to be as karma-free as possible. It's the one thing to identify and clear the past, and another not to create new knots. So if there's one thing, when I was working with the shaman that I used to work with, I remember her telling us that we had a limited amount of time to kind of clear up this is why we did soul retrievals and stuff, because if we knew what it was, is the consequences of would catch up quickly. If you were doing something, I don't want to say a sin, but if you knew that you were acting out of integrity, that the consequences would hit you much faster and harder than they had before. And with every year, it'll come faster and harder, and you just can't get away with anything anymore. I don't know if everybody feels that way. I certainly do.
That's really interesting. I remember in
instant karma.
In Anthroposophy, something that Steiner said reminds me of this, because he was talking about how something had changed from humanity starting in 1879. And it goes deep because it goes into the spiritual war between 1840 and 1879 and these forces. But that post 1879, much more of what we think and what becomes reality is closer together. So I noticed that there was a huge movement, if you go to the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, about positive thinking. I'm sure it was always true, but it seems specifically true in that there's something that has caught up with the way that we think in relation to the circumstances that we're in. So the kind of quickening that's going on there is, it's not a good time to hang out. It's a better time to be proactive and projecting for the kind of future and the kind of reality that you want in that future. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Okay, what do you got?
THP3 free, the left hand or right hand, it all seems to tap into our natural tribalism. Shouldn't our real aim to be balanced Christ consciousness?
Well, remember, the war of all against all was the goal of Ahriman, was to make the right side of the body go to war with the left side of the body. So there is a battle that takes place in this. And but nonetheless, I think that in the mystery school tradition, they identify the obstacles. In other words, they understand there's a spiritual evolutionary track that we're on, that we're proceeding upon. and that the obstacle is that there's another group that's involved, which is trying to divert that spiritual evolution. And that's the Ahrimanic group, which again, Steiner spent all these decades identifying. It's a weird thing, for him to stick his neck out and say, there's this dark harmonic force. This is what it looked like. I sculpted it, and using the name from the Persian mythology, I'm sure he tapped directly into the spiritual realm to figure out how does this operate, and to identify it as having a deep involvement with technology and how we get into that technology and how this electrical age is going to provide an opening for this. He wasn't saying abandon technology, remember, and I would never say that either. But it's going into it aware so that you don't become part of the machine. It still becomes a tool for you. The way that it's operating right now is that, our data is getting mined. We're getting manipulated through entrainment. So the technology is not working the way it had promised to be, which is here's a great breakthrough and here's all the wonderful things you can do with it. Instead, it's providing a platform for a very small group to control, the 8 billion people on the planet. And so those people have a very high opinion of themselves and a very low opinion of humanity. This is the nature of the problem. And in terms of any kind of spiritual intention, it seems dead in them, and they want to deaden it in everyone else. So I think that's where the culture gets to a crisis, and it looks to me like it's a wartime style crisis. Whether that turns into an open shooting war and all the rest is, that goes into a deeper level of political analysis. But nonetheless, it's a war directed on the side of the leadership group against the populace. So the question is, the first thing you do is you identify who's doing it and where it's coming from and the best way to combat it. Now, what's interesting is it's not a traditional war in that, we're not in a certain period of time where one group has a certain amount of munitions and the other group, and they get together and smack. It's more that you're looking at, it reminds me very much, when I think about it, of a net. And it is that they're dropping a net on society, and what we're looking for is weaknesses in the net that we are able to exploit and then eliminate the net. That's really what it feels like. And so when we look at something like the eighth sphere as a model, I think anthroposophy is giving us an insight. We're moving a little bit closer. Yes.
So, fight for the sky. If the left-hand elites were ever able to vaccinate us against spirituality, as Steiner warned, or mess with our HMAT2 gene, what do you think that would look like, and how would we know they did it? Follow-up question, Simone Nyman. Do you think that the CIA might play the alien virus card, hence bringing in Nolan, the immunologist?
Yes. I think that's exactly what they have. If you look at the UFO threat op, the PSYOP that it is, because suddenly they want to talk all about UFOs and all the rest of it. By the way, they still keep all the records. They still haven't released anything. And they've just talked about how they don't want to release any of those records. They don't want a real conversation about this. They just want the media to talk in a fluff version about it, and for them to fluff it up enough to create a threat program, and then to have this Arrow office as the intermediary between the DNI, in this case, Avril Haines, and the intelligence apparatus and Defense Department. So what we're looking at there is the development of an op when they include so many medical specialists involved in that op on the CIA side. And if you looked at that original TTSA group, not only are they high-level CIA people, almost all of them, and I would say over 90%, had something medical in their background. You can't count DeLong because he was just the bobo in the middle of it. But, there's something specifically about that. Even Elizondo had patents on tropical diseases and things like that. So, but Nolan, as an immunologist and somebody they're putting forward and being like, this is the transparency guy, and we'll go with him because Elizondo's been screwing it up so badly, fighting with everyone, that he's pretty interesting because Nolan pretends, or it goes along this line, that he's had alien encounters and things of this nature. And that's part of this also, which is they have all these CIA agents that are now contactees. That's pretty suspicious. Let's face it. What are the odds? But the next piece on that is that he's doing big shout outs to his great hero, Anthony Fauci, on Twitter. And, you know, I put that out and people could not believe it. I got a number of emails from people saying, there's no way that he did that. You know, where is that? Or whatever. I was like, it's not me. It's his Twitter feed. Go look at it. No, he did it. All right. He's a big fan of Fauci. And I'd like to know the depths that relationship goes to, especially after Rand Paul promised that as soon as the Republicans retake the Senate, that they're going to put Fauci through his paces and find out where all the royalties are coming from. Yeah, that's pretty crucial.
Habardian, DJ, is this quote net a way to deviate souls from their natural astral ascension and trapping them in the eighth sphere? How do we avoid it? Perfect
question. How do we avoid it? Absolutely. I think the net is related to the eighth sphere, and I think it's kind of the best description of what's happening. And if they are dropping the net on us, think about a lot of things like the incredible Starlink satellite situation. There's something wrong with this fundamentally, and that there's no, there's no debate about it. There's no questions the American people can ask. It just gets done and we don't get any word in it. It's ridiculous. It's taxation without representation. And I don't trust Musk at all, not even a little. So, I feel like the things that he's bringing forward are easily manipulated. I don't even think that that's a real person in a sense. I mean, he's an actual individual, yes. But when he says something with the level that he's on, with the billions of dollars that are behind him, we're talking about committees speaking through a person. So nobody at that level even speaks their mind anymore. And I get into this with people about Joe Rogan, believe it or not, as well. You take $300 million, you're not really talking yourself anymore. That's just the nature of the thing. And that's why every once in a while you see these weird apologies and things like, it's like, what? You're doing video apologies for things. So we have to understand it on a real level. You can only get away with so much when you're in that system. Tucker Carlson, God love him, but you work for Fox, you work for the man, and they're only going to let you say certain things. So let's get real about that. The stuff that we're delivering here it's directly supported by you. So the Ideas Room supports me to do it. And I don't have any limits for the things that I present to you, because there's no way that somebody could shut me down and say, you can't say that. We gave you $300 million. So that's very important, because that's the kind of information we need. We can't get filtered stuff. That's fine for the masses, maybe. But, again, even stuff like that, I would take over the likes of the sadistic CNN or MSNBC and real creeps like that. But this kind of connection, I think, is what is crucial now, so you get the information. And I always am promoting the people that I think are making the biggest difference, whether that's Dr. Farrell or the work that Gigi's doing. There's so many people that I want to support in doing all this. And these are the conversations that we need, not $300 million Spotify conversations. If something good gets through on that, great, but it's a control system. They're still figuring out how to control the marketplace. That's a very different thing. Did I answer the question? Okay.
Okay, so Polaris 23. I'm confused. Is the Great White Brotherhood in Casey World the same White Brotherhood from the hidden place in Tibet with Moria and Kuthumi? And Jay Vanderbest, how do we know the Great White Brotherhood is who they say they are? Is the Great White Brotherhood any relation or connection to the old ones?
Yes, fundamentally, The Great White Brotherhood that gets identified as the Ascended Masters in Theosophy is the same group that's being referred to in the Casey work and in Steiner's work. I have a few quotes from Steiner about them that I think would be appropriate to insert here. And it gets directly to that. I also have a quote about the eighth sphere. Let me do those now. Here's some of the Steiner art about those higher streams coming down to the initiates, filling them with knowledge. So there's something about the anthroposophical art. It just moves you into a different place by looking at it. I guess that's the power of it. Okay. Let's see. Here's some Steiner for you on this. One of the great masters who are leaders of the fifth epoch is predestined to take over the leadership of the sixth epoch. We're in the fifth now. The sixth epoch will be the first great epoch to have as its Manu, which is master, one who is a brother to earthly man. The earlier masters, the Manus, were from other worlds, are handing over their leadership to a fellow human being. When he talks about other worlds in this case, solar beings, moon beings, in the cosmology of the Steiner work. The masters, as a rule, are not personages known to history. Well, that's pretty interesting. Think about that one. Here's something that Steiner had to say early on about this. Behind the movement, that's what will become anthroposophy, there are highly evolved beings whom we call masters, who have already completed the path which the rest of humanity still has to tread. They are now active as the great teachers and are already engaged in work on higher planes to which the rest of mankind will evolve during the course of the next periods of development. They do their work on the physical plane through their messengers, the first of whom was H.P. Blavatsky. The masters never found an outer organization or society, nor would they administer one. This is in the whole character and leadership, purely and simply the work of men living on the earth. And so he goes into a whole thing about this battle between these Luciferian forces, because remember, he splits Lucifer and Ahriman. I won't go into all that, but I will take a few quotes from this because I think it's important. In order to annul the battle between Jehovah and Lucifer, the White Lodge, now this is the Great White Brotherhood, which was just in its beginning, had to obtain material from one of the other planets. This differed essentially from the astral substance that had come over from the moon. This is very deep cosmology, but hang with me here. From the astral karmic animal substance. The possibility arose of leading over substance from other planets, new passions, less vehement, but conceived on the basis of independence. The new material was brought over from Mars. Thus, in the first half of our Earth evolution, astral substances from Mars were introduced. A great advance was brought about through the introduction of the astral substance from Mars. External civilization on the Earth arose through the fact that hardening on the one side of the spiritualization on the other side were prevented. So basically, these beings at different times, Lucifer and Ahriman, have tried to gain control of the body. And so the Great White Brotherhood has introduced elements to prevent this from happening in the evolutionary structure. Let's go into another piece. The human astral bodies still had to receive a third impact. This was brought down from Mercury. Christ united his sovereignty. If one has the will to ascend the heights in order to find the way to the gods, one needs Mercury, the divine messenger. He is the one who prepared the path of the Christ from the middle of the Atlantean root race onwards in order to later enter into their astral body. And then he goes on to talk about Christian Rosenkreutz. So we're starting to see from Steiner here how he's viewing this group and how they operate. Now, Steiner wasn't a big one about hanging around talking about the Ascended Masters. He really wasn't. The Ascended Masters are much more of a theosophical theme. Steiner de-emphasized them because it seems like that's the role that they play, in the sense that they're not Um, they're to be understood, but it's humanity that has to do the work. They're in the background supporting humanity and moving the culture. Steiner then explains that at Christmas, the sun stood at the lowest point in the year, and on the 25th began to ascend. And that in this night, the masters of the White Brotherhood had a conference in which they sent out the power of the sun of the coming year to those people who wanted entirely to devote themselves to them, to surrender their personality entirely and ask them for strength. If one celebrates Christmas this way, ask the master in this way, when they send their strength into these people on December 25th, so that the power of the master works through them. And when they asked him, what are the characteristics of these ascended masters? And he said, he gave them this list in describing Moria: truth, wisdom, immeasurability, goodness, beauty, illimitableness. That's an interesting one. That must be a translation. Peace, blessing, integrity. So we have this idea then that the new Jupiter in the Steiner cosmology is what the Earth is evolving into, and that the White Brotherhoods are the guardian of this whole process. So that whole religious train, New Jerusalem and all the rest of it, is to make us through the spiritual evolutionary track and move on to this new Jupiter. What's going on in between is that there's a combined power now of Lucifer and Ahriman working together where they didn't before. Now they're working together. Before it was, I'm going to subvert humanity on my own. And the Ahriman force would say, I'm going to subvert humanity on my own. Now they've given up and said, we're going to work together. So that's not a good combination for humanity using Steiner's reasoning. So when we look at this process, what they're doing is they've set up an alternative evolutionary track from the new Jupiter track. And that track is the eighth sphere. The eighth sphere is basically a virtual reality realm that sucks in our attention. And it creates an artificial step, and it does not allow the normal spiritual evolutionary track to happen. And reincarnation, of course, is a piece of the spiritual science aspect. But what he's saying is the reincarnation thing moves differently, because if you look at the mystery school tradition, your soul leaves Earth, it goes through in different various bodies, the other planets, not physical bodies, but you learn different things. They're like school classrooms. You pass through the Earth again. And then ultimately you develop, and then Arcturus is the way out of the system, and you go on. That is the cosmology around it. This thing, these groups, Lucifer and Ahriman, are so attached to humanity parasitically that the object then is for them to block humanity from moving in that natural chain, developing what Steiner calls the warmth of Vulcan to create new Jupiter, New Jerusalem. So that's the big, large cosmological wheel of the whole thing. The eighth sphere has a very practical, down-to-earth purpose for these people. And on a daily basis now, we see people completely sucked in to video games. It's completely sucked into their phone, completely sucked in to these different things. And the quality of attention is not, what you get when you're reading a good book or studying something important. It is a kind of a vacancy, a kind of addiction to vacancy. So that's a reality on our side about the eighth sphere. Here's how we can start to understand what Steiner was saying. Yes.
Hizzo. 6 red heifers just delivered to Israel. They're starting the ceremony to bring the second coming. This is news to me, but we'll have to see if this is true, but that's fascinating.
I can't even imagine. Well, I think, the second coming thing, it's been around for a long time, people thinking in this way. The mystery school aspect, nobody knows, right? But I think the mystery school aspect on this is that the second coming is more about Christ coming in the astral plane around the etheric body of the earth. That's the aspect, and that relies on people creating that space by being in touch with Christ and creating that ability for that etheric Christ body to be fully inhabited on the earth. It's pretty fascinating, let's face it, when you start to get into concepts like that, and Antichrist, of course, which so much of the Aramonic piece is Antichrist. There's no question. Literally opposed to the Christian principles. So, this is interesting too, because people like Blavatsky, for example,
Wow.
had their own distortions around Christianity, resented it. There's some explanations that it had to do with being persecuted by Christians in an earlier life. So, we're talking on one hand about what we're saying in terms of Christianity, and then there's this other thing, which is the history of what's been done with it, which is very different from anything spiritual. Just ask the Aztecs when Cortez got there. I mean, that has nothing to do with Christ. Yes.
Hizzo says videos all over TikTok. They were delivered there from Texas. Exactly what DJ has been discussing about the etheric Christ body. He is right on point.
Interesting.
Mhm.
From Texas. Well, we have to hear more about that one. Look, if you have anything on it, send it to admin@darkjournalist.com. I'll definitely take a look at it. I'm going to read a quote about the eighth sphere here, and then we'll take some more of your questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're deep, deep tonight in the realm of the eighth sphere with the Great White Brotherhood and the teachings of Edgar Cayce, anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, Blavatsky. The whole gang is here tonight. We're taking your questions now. I want to remind you, while I have your attention, if you're new especially, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. And that's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch through the incredible censorship that we've been seeing all around the internet, and especially with deep conversations like the ones we're having here now in the Ideas Room. Basically, you'll get that once a week, and it'll let you know about the incredible shows and interviews that we have coming up for you, along with some documentaries and events. We also, if you want to become a member, it's very easy at the site, and that's going to be particularly good thing to do with the stuff that we have coming up, some member specials, shall we say, that are going to be dynamite. And so we've kept that all very reasonable and such. So stand up and be counted, be a member, join the newsletter, and all the rest of it. All right, Miss Olivia, I'm going to read this. And this kind of answers two questions back about the eighth sphere, because I didn't really fully answer that. Steiner will answer it even better than I could, if you can imagine that. That, you see, was the intention of Lucifer and Ahriman from the beginning of Earth evolution, to let the whole of this evolution disappear into the eighth sphere. Think about that. All of the evolution disappearing into the eighth sphere. It was therefore necessary that a counterweight should be created by those spirits who belong to the hierarchy of the spirits of form. And the other counterweight they created consists in this. Into the space, as it were, of the eighth sphere, something was inserted which works against the eighth sphere. To present this correctly, we must show the Earth here in this Earth sphere diagram. What he shows in the diagram, I've shown this before, is the Earth interlocked with the eighth sphere. They're tied together, sort of like the number 8. The outer counterweight they created consists in this. Into the space, as it were, the space, the eighth sphere, something was inserted which works against the eighth sphere. To present this correctly, we'll show the diagram. The eighth sphere belongs to our physical Earth in the sense indicated. We're surrounded everywhere by the imaginations into which the aim is that mineral materiality shall continually be drawn. There lies the reason for the sacrifice made by Jehovah. The precipitation of substance far denser than the other mineralized substance. This is very Steiner-esque, but bear with me because there's a big payoff here. There lies the reason for the sacrifice made by Jehovah, the precipitation of substance far denser than the other mineralized substance. This was established by Jehovah as moon, counteracting agent. It was the substance of extreme density. And this density was described by A.P. Sennett as substance of a far denser physical mineral character than exists anywhere in the earth. Hence, Lucifer and Ahriman cannot dissolve it away into their world of imaginations. And so this moon circles around the globe of dense matter, solid, dense, indestructible. If you read carefully enough, you will find that even the descriptions of the moon given by physicists tally with this back then. Everything that was available on the earth was drawn out and placed there in order that there should be enough physical matter incapable of being wrested away. Again, giving us the goal that they're trying to basically take the substance of this earth to create this eighth sphere, and they're doing it using the imaginations of individuals. So it gets intense. I'm going to skip ahead. Jehovah then must be regarded as that being who, even in the physical domain, has ensured that not all materiality can be drawn away by Lucifer and Ahriman. And then at the right time, equal care will be taken by the same spirit that the moon shall re-enter the earth when the earth is strong enough to receive it, when the danger is averted by the development that has meanwhile taken place. So, you know, Jehovah gets a bad rap in a lot of ways as the Old Testament God. But here we're seeing that it's Jehovah's sacrifice that creates the ability for evolution to continue. So Lucifer and Ahriman are working in this evolutionary change to subvert this. Here's a little more information from a deep mystery secret about the human head in relation to this. Think about this in relation to, say, virtual reality. In the human domain, too, it was necessary that a counterweight should be created to the intention aimed at the human head. Just as the outside world, materiality had to be densified so that Lucifer and Ahriman cannot dissolve it by their alchemy, so in the human being, something had to be set over against the organ that can most easily be attacked by Ahriman. Yahweh, Jehovah, had therefore to take care, just as he had done in respect to the mineral domain, that not everything can succumb to the attacks of Lucifer and Ahriman. Care had to be taken that not everything in man proceeding from the head can become the prey of Ahriman, that not everything shall depend upon head activity and the activity of the outward turned senses, for then Lucifer and Ahriman would have been victors. It was necessary that a counterweight should be created in the domain of earthly life, that there should be in the human being something entirely independent of the head. And what they say is they develop a great sense of love through the heart chakra, in essence. And that's the counterweight, because the head can't be taken away. If they do that, they'll still have to deal with this whole heart aspect. So that gets very deep, and he talks about the violent battle that persists through history, the battle waged by Ahriman against everything that comes from this domain. Lucifer and Ahriman want to force on man the exclusive sovereignty of the head, and they launch their attacks by way of the head against everything that is purely natural affinity. I think that takes us to a place where we understand that their whole victory is aimed at having us think a certain way and having those thoughts influence everything else. So that's a good way, a kind of an easy snapshot for us to think of in terms of them building the eighth sphere. Yes.
Wow, there's such great stuff. First of all, Occult fan, quote, Zach Waller, the executive director of our organization, HaYovel, was privileged to attend the welcoming ceremony at the airport along with a group of Christians and Jews. Ironically, the search for these red heifers, as well as the process of bringing them to Israel, has been spearheaded by a Christian Zionist from Texas. There's going to be so much more. Listen, we know the power of ritual, right?
Yeah,
and even Jesus, he had to fulfill the prophecies.
Coming into Jerusalem on a donkey?
Yes, exactly. The symbols.
Yeah.
This is damn interesting. So we will follow up on that definitely.
Very interesting.
So,
okay.
I want to make sure we get to this one. Wendy Eater, what expectations does the Great White Brotherhood have of non-initiates to do on our own behalf? First of all, what just to confess, I've been praying, although they have not appeared to me, to the Great White Brotherhood for years. Can I, someone who's not an initiate, can I call to them for support, for guidance in my spiritual path, would they respond to that?
I mean, of course, yeah. And it is through our interest and through our study that we start to understand the nature of what it is. Well, that reminds me of that group that was in Virginia in the 90s. What was the name of the group? They were like a Findhorn type thing, but they were in West Virginia, and it was run by a woman.
Oh, it's like MAP, the
MAP,
medical assistance
exactly,
program.
yes.
Yeah.
And her name was Paralandra.
Paralandra.
And I don't know what happened to that movement or whatever. But this book was interesting in that MAP it stood for something. It was about basically working with the Great White Brotherhood for medical purposes. And so that's what you made me think of there with that. My answer right off the bat would be absolutely. Because again, I don't think these masters and things can do it for us, but we need the support to do these things. And I'm not saying that you should project that there's some outside mystery group that can solve everything. But I think it resonates with us that there's been a group behind the scenes moving that train of humanity forward. And that it's in that spiritual place, in our own realm, in our own thoughts, that we start to get the impression that something is helping us along, shall I say. So that's crucial, I would think. And it reminds me, I saved a lot of quotes tonight. This one is from Henry Alcott. Let's see if I have a picture of Alcott. Let's not forget Elizabeth Clare Prophet. She considered herself a messenger of the Great White Brotherhood. Well, she's an interesting one. There's no question about it. Here's someone else who thought very highly of himself. How about Aleister Crowley? Decked out to the max. And there's a reason why I mentioned Crowley. I hate to divert from the Paralandra thing to this, but I did want to mention that Lamb, fundamentally, the impression that I get is that this is a dweller in that eighth sphere realm, and that is what he was doing with Crowley, was communicating with Crowley from that eighth sphere place. And you can see that something unusual about the character and the figure of Lamb who appeared to Crowley. And fundamentally, what it is he was a teacher, and the size of the head is remarkable, and of course gives that resemblance to the Greys. But beyond that, there's a lot of weird things about Lamb. One of the things that I took from it was the beings that were contacting Crowley were operating and seeing if he couldn't become a kind of a great tag team partner here on planet Earth for their plans. But there's something that is almost kind of astrally dead, without substance, from these beings. They still possess an incredible intellect. They still possess incredible knowledge, but they seem like almost like wax versions of real people, which some people have said the Greys and that whole thing seem like. But also, if we look at our friend Lamb here, we're also seeing that, when we think back to what Steiner was saying about the head and how there is now operative in the human race something that is independent of the head, but their whole thing is that they want to force on man the exclusive sovereignty of the head. And then just look at the size of the head. So this idea then that Crowley is contacting an eighth sphere dweller, that seemed to open up rather dramatically. And Ahriman himself, he's the fundamental architect of the eighth sphere. And again, the size of the head is extraordinary. And remember, when Steiner was sculpting this, he thought he had to do it quickly, because the more he worked on it and tuned into Ahriman, the heavier he felt the world was around him. He was feeling like he was being concretized himself. That's a good indication for where this whole spirit of things is going. Yes.
So Robert Ayala, is the White Brotherhood a recipient of the Atlantean knowledge? And Christine Laurel, DJ, how far back does Ahriman go? Did this, or him, did he force derail the Atlanteans?
Oh, he's been with us through the evolutionary track. So he got himself involved in the evolution of the Earth. And there's a deep explanation for how this happened in Steiner's cosmology. I won't go into the whole thing here because it's long. The only thing I'll say is that there's a period of time where the moon comes out of the Earth. And in that period, when it's on the Earth and it hasn't yet left, we're kind of in an unprotected state. It's one of the worst state of affairs because the solar beings have gone on and the moon hasn't left yet. So we're still at the mercy of kind of darker forces. And then the Ahrimanic force takes itself into the role of the evolutionary track of humanity on Earth. And so he becomes part of the pulse of the Earth and he becomes the thing to be overcome. So, whenever they talk about there's an angel on your shoulder, there's a devil on your other shoulder, telling you this and telling you that, it really, that's sort of the Christ Ahrimanic combination there. And then the Luciferic beings show up differently in history as at times working with humanity and at other times, harvesting humanity. So they're more of a mixed bag and they get themselves involved in everything from art and culture and all this other things. So they don't have a totally negative impact on humanity the way that the Ahrimanic force does. But supposedly the showdown with Ahriman through the technology, if we do it correctly, and this is in the big picture that Steiner's looking at, and so therefore it's something he's giving us as an overview. And we have to kind of test that out for ourselves. But his general impression is that if we can face that force and then basically obtain through that battle with Ahriman what we need to move on in our own spiritual development, then it'll all be for the best. But if Ahriman shows up and catches mankind in this kind of, humanity slumbering and, people getting brain chip implants, then it's going to be a bad scene, and it's dangerous because remember what they talk about with Ahriman and the eighth sphere is it takes evolution and it makes it disappear. So when people project themselves into the eighth sphere, that's it, so it is it's a harvesting thing. So it is, when you get down to language like satanic and things of this nature, I think it definitely qualifies, Yes.
This is great. Lucy Rain says the Hopi prophecy rock shows people with their heads detached from their bodies.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
I've been wanting to do a Hopi show for a long time. And G. Taylor says, when I went under ketamine IV therapy, I saw an Ahriman head sticking out of a large block of stone. It was weird.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I hear a lot of things about ketamine. Isn't that interesting? Wow.
Feeling Better Naturally says, how do I get to know and align with the Great White Brotherhood? The first thing I would say, which is why I have been praying to them for many years, is that there's an esoteric rule of you have to ask and they won't just come.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's about like crossing the threshold. So it may take years for them to present themselves, but you have to keep inviting them. Right. And you have to keep setting your intention again and again and again and asking for preparation so that you'll be ready and deserving, worthy of them contacting you.
Yeah, it is the seek and you shall find. There's no question. That's a fundamental in mystery teachings for enhancement in your spiritual life. This is the great Jesus teaching. But I think that that's absolutely right. I think it's a matter of in your own private thoughts. It's very interesting because very often we have abilities. There's a reason why we're attracted to certain subjects and things. And so we have more abilities latent than we realize in relation to this. So understanding the role of the Great White Brotherhood, their role in moving humanity forward, their role in setting up things like the School of the Prophets, which Elijah came out of, and in the mystery school tradition, Elijah comes back as John the Baptist and baptizes Jesus. This is interesting because it's a fundamental place in the Bible where a number of the figures in the mystery schools have pointed it out, but they forgot to take out, because originally reincarnation was in the Bible, and it was taken out by Origen in the 4th century, I believe, 3rd or 4th century. So the esoteric wave of Christianity, some of the early groups around Christianity, they totally had the reincarnation part. It was taken out, extracted, and it was kept out for a long time. And it doesn't re-enter the stream of Christianity in any way, shape, or form, really, until you get groups like anthroposophy reintroducing it as a concept. So there's nothing in reincarnation that contradicts real Christianity, for sure, even though the regular Christian tradition doesn't acknowledge it. But anyway, there's that section where, after John the Baptist is beheaded, the disciples come and they say, wasn't Elijah supposed to come before you? Like, why didn't that happen to Christ? And he said, Elijah did come, but they chopped his head off. So this is interesting because it says, then the disciples understood that he spoke of John the Baptist. Why did they make that connection? It's because they understood, Elijah reincarnated as John the Baptist and was killed because he was, an enemy of the Pharisees and was promoting Christ. So, think about that. That is one of those pieces or sections that show that there's reincarnation in the Bible. My own kind of feeling about this is that you don't need to accept reincarnation in order to progress spiritually. It's just that there's a reason why they're giving that piece back on the mystery side, and they're reintroducing us to that so that we can understand we've been through a series of different incarnations and lifetimes and may continue to do so. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, is the 8th sphere an individual trap, or can it be a group trap?
It's definitely a group trap. I mean, but they work just like a good religion. The 8th sphere, Lucifer and Ahriman are well used to religion. They are, they've run many, many religions. I'm sure when the Atlanteans turned to human sacrifice and things like that, it was the Ahrimanic groups behind it. But so they work with an individual person and they work across the board. They had targeted North America after the destruction of Atlantis. And so there's an energy here that is Ahrimanic. But, we've seen that there's been a huge counteraction through the Great White Brotherhood, even in the setting up of the American Revolution. And many of those people involved in the revolution were brothers of lesser or higher degree in the mystery schools. No question about it. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions.
2 more questions. So HC Kenobi, is there reincarnation out of the 8th sphere? So once you're trapped, what is the trap like?
This is interesting. That's a good point. Well, here's the technical specs of the way it's laid out, as best I can tell from anthroposophy. So basically, the idea is we get sucked into a false realm while living on Earth, like virtual reality and things of this nature, a fantasy realm. And that when we die, as a result of that, those people who get consumed by this fantasy realm go into the 8th sphere, and then they reincarnate directly on Earth instead of going through the normal chain of evolutionary steps. Like, as I mentioned, in the Casey work, he talks about going to each planet and learning something, kind of like classrooms, basically, and then coming back to Earth. So that's a traditional spiritual evolutionary piece. What happens in this case is that the 8th sphere becomes, you basically become more and more hardened to the earth and unaware of your circumstances. So you're harvested. So instead of having that traditional line of developing spiritually, you're returning quickly through the eighth sphere to the earth, and they just keep that loop up. And basically, what the way that Steiner describes it is basically you disappear in the eighth sphere. So awareness prevents that, even the awareness of what the eighth sphere is. So it becomes a very important thing for humanity, at least to have a shot at, to reject or accept the concept. And I think that people now can really take a look at it and see how it operates. Whereas I think 100 years ago it was hard for people to swallow, because they were like, how am I going to get sucked into a fantasy realm? Now you can see where everyone's sucked into so much that it's overloaded our minds through media and video games and virtual reality, and God knows what they're up to with the metaverse, that it's a different story. I think people can understand this, and this is why it's coming to the fore now. But it is crucial, I would say, that we do understand it. That's from the Montaigne Tarocchi, the original drawing of the angel of the eighth sphere, looking at it, and crisscrossed with Ahriman. The Ahrimanic force, yes.
So it seems to me that anybody could recognize the similarity. We've all gone to the movies and lost ourselves, kind of forgot that we were watching a movie, right? But then you remember, but you're still sort of caught up in it, sort of like a dream. And then you go out and especially if you saw a matinee and it's you walk outside and it's sunny and it's bright, and you realize you sort of come back into your own reality, and you're like, whoa, I was really out there. I was lost in that movie. So
yes.
This is, how do we know that this question always comes up, that we're not in the eighth sphere already, that this life that we're living is not a simulation, because it seems to me that it's similar. And would the eighth sphere be just another level of degeneration, of forgetfulness, of ignorance, of forgetting our true nature?
Yeah. Well, look, there's all sorts of ways to use fantasy life. Some of the greatest writers, Dickens and people like this, have had an incredible fantasy life, right? And so there's nothing wrong with fantasy. But I guess what we're looking at is the extreme use of fantasy to substitute for a real life. That's different. And so therefore you'd be living, and we've seen people do this more and more, where they'll live an online life and their regular life doesn't seem like there's too much happening, but online they're sucked into all these different, I'm sure with the metaverse this will really become true. So those people are sitting ducks for the eighth sphere coming through this technological wave. Now this involves also the discovery of other dimensions, which we're getting a lot through CERN. Bad place to get it because again you have the scientific materialism umbrella weighing in over this. Fundamentally the mystery schools came out of the shadows because why? Because scientific materialism was taking over, and even the churches who were freaked out by spiritualism didn't stop them very much, because they were so freaked out themselves that scientific materialism was going to run them out. And so this is the nature of the thing. The scientific materialism is such an easy thing to say, you know what? Forget about your spiritual life. You don't have to worry about any of that. If it can't be measured, then there's nothing there, and it's just all fantasy. So just get in with us in our hedonistic, materialistic point of view on things, and only think of it from a Darwinian perspective. You were just evolved from an animal, and you just live an animal's life, and forget about all that other lofty stuff. That is the eighth sphere trap. So people are living in that fantasy. They're warping themselves into it. So somebody who has a grasp on a religious life is already realms away from anything having to do with the eighth sphere. Now, there's certain mechanical ways, as I've said, of doing things, as we've talked about, any certain types of extremism that lend themselves to being mechanically drawn into that eighth sphere. So I would say the way to look at fantasy is it can operate either as a great outlet for your creative abilities, or it can operate as something as a substitute for your real life, in which case you need to wake up and distance yourself from that level of identification. So it becomes a balancing act with every individual, but certainly the nature of the environment, and I think more and more, as we're seeing, they're going to develop in that metaverse, versions. You're going to be able to live your whole life in that thing. And by the way, I heard that Disney just bought almost a quarter of it. So they're investing a lot in it. They must be expecting this thing is going to go like gangbusters. But what is it that we're talking about? Basically, you're putting on your virtual reality machine and jumping into some artificial computer thing that they've created. This is just like the BS that Musk says, oh, I'm going to, project my consciousness into the cube, an avatar. Look, and they know this too. Your consciousness, your physical consciousness is attached to your physical body by means of what they call the silver cord of your pituitary, your pineal, and your Leydig glands. And so that isn't something that you can just offer up and say, my consciousness is projected into this thing. So whatever it is that they're up to with that, it's almost like abducting your consciousness and your awareness, just to even have that idea floating out there. It's absurd. So no, we're not projecting our consciousness into a cube. And, where if anything, we're learning about the energy centers and the chakras in our own body and how to balance out the interspace between our spiritual awareness and our unconscious and conscious mind. That's a much more exciting evolutionary step than putting electrodes and brain chips. And, come on, this is the nature of what they're going to make it look alluring, make it look like it's progress, etc. And that's where there's going to be a group of us who go along with it. And there's going to be a very substantial group that does not. And, that's just the nature of the thing. It's just like, the whole war thing and the gigantic propaganda aspects that they've used to have these wars. And they get some people to go along with it and get caught up in the fantasy, and other people call it out. And then they go after the people who call it out and say, oh, they're anti-patriotic and all the rest. They're doing that with the Zelensky thing and trying to get us to get on board. We paid this guy $80 billion. Look at America. Look at the things that are happening in those cities. You can't afford to be giving Zelensky or challenging, by putting a NATO member on the doorstep of Russia. You can't afford a war with Russia. So these are the neocons that have hijacked this situation, and the kind of psychosis around celebrating Zelensky as a heroic leader. That's brain entrainment. You're being brainwashed. The guy is not a hero or leader. He has Nazi factions in his group. He was a weird comedian that they plucked out of obscurity that the World Economic Forum wanted to push on us. And he runs around everywhere saying, hey, everyone has to support me with long-range missiles. And, I don't approve of the things that Russia has done going in there and causing a war on these people. But I think we're engaged in a process instead of, where's the peace process? We're just engaged in provoking this situation. And we keep, hemorrhaging money into this machine. And who's getting the money? It's Lockheed Martin. It's Boeing. I mean, it's all the defense contractors. So this is the sick nature of the situation on the ground. That's the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in. And that's very harmonic activity. Let me tell you. All right, everyone. Fantastic. We're going to take the last question of the night. I'm going to remind you that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. And we're going deep tonight. We went deep now on the Great White Brotherhood. We're going to do more, of course, in relation to this subject. Absolutely fascinating. The work of Edgar Casey is going to keep us very well informed on this. The incredible traditions of the Gurdjieff groups keeping the mystery school moves alive. And let's not forget the foundation of the Theosophical Society, 1875, with Helena Blavatsky. And Henry Olcott, who really took incredible chances to make this movement come alive, and went from someone who was in, he was a colonel and he was in the Lincoln administration, and he went into someone who was trying to prove that these masters of Great White Brotherhood existed. I mean, it's quite a remarkable life if you think about it. And I wanted to mention also that we can't forget, and it's often overlooked, that the person who founded the Theosophical Society was, along with Blavatsky, was Emma Britton. And she did that right here from Boston, and Blavatsky was in New York. And this is how they coordinated it. And she got left out of a lot of this picture. But her story is a fascinating one. We've told it in the Orphic Circle stories, but she was a remarkable psychic from the age of a child and was used by this Orphic Circle group to get information on everything from state secrets to the nature of reality. And her story of becoming psychic and doing all this channeling for these groups, understanding the nature of that, and then becoming an actress in the 19th century, and then founding the Theosophical Society. All that started when she was 9, that they did this. And that, to understand these groups, there were a lot of them in that period. And the Orphic Circle is an interesting one because, when she looked back on the whole experience, she actually said that they had helped her develop this incredible psychic gift that she had. And so, it's a very fascinating story that she tells in her own books. But I don't think, Emma Britton, I think we have to understand on a whole different level to understand the foundation of theosophy, because she is somebody who led a fascinating life. Last question, Miss Olivia.
So, what is the stated intention of the Great White Brotherhood?
Well, it's a group.
What is their relationship with humanity?
Yeah, there's no question that they're moving us, just like in the early Atlantean times when humanity had projected themselves and was in trouble, and Emilius showed up, and that whole Emilius group development of spiritual development, the Law of One, they created a path for humanity not to get trapped in materiality and not to lose that connection with their spiritual lives or get harvested by beings from the Ahrimanic Luciferian side. So this is a long-standing history with the Great White Brotherhood, and the Great White Brotherhood has been there behind so many movements, from Christianity to Egyptian mysticism and all these different groups. And when you're talking about groups that came out of, Egyptian mysticism, the Kabbalah, and all these things, there's a central root into those Atlantean mysteries. And that's what I think we get the story of through the Steiner work. But what I can see is that they had a major role in the development of anthroposophy and on Casey's work. And so they were laying that foundation out there for us, not as something that they could do and we just had to hang on for the ride and eat the popcorn and all that, but something where in that inner consciousness, we developed a relationship. We could see the actions of this group around us. So the Great White Brotherhood is kind of, it's understood as the foundation of the groups that were preparing for Christ's entry through the Essenes and all the mystical. If you really go into the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then this is interesting that Casey had talked all about the Essenes before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 47. Here's Casey laying out the whole thing before they found the scrolls. And what did he say? He said, 1, they not only had Jews, they had Gentiles in the Essenes, even though they were a Jewish mystical sect. 2, they included women. Well, that was pretty radical because the Pharisees and the traditional priesthood in Jerusalem didn't accept women, and they certainly didn't accept Gentiles. So this is very interesting. But on Casey's track, what did they get into? Astrology, numerology, cosmology, astral projection. They learned all these things. And who went through the Essenes, John the Baptist, and Christ. So this is how all the kind of esoteric Christianity picture comes together. And they say that John the Baptist and Christ took the last of the Brotherhood vows in the Great Pyramid, and through the empty sarcophagus, stayed 3 days, did the whole resurrection ceremony before it even the Christ ministry had started. So this is the esoteric version. And remember, so much of the traditional life of Christ is lost from the time he's 12 years old to the time he's 30. There's nothing in between. So the Gospels give us his mission, and they give us his very early life, but there's all those years in between. And there's a good trail that Jesus went to India and practiced with the high yogis there. So he was operating through that network of mystery schools, and he being the head, the leader of the White Brotherhood. Absolutely. It's a fascinating story. And it goes, when you get it on the Casey side, he said, they ask him, when did Christ become aware of the fact that he was going to be the savior of the world? And Casey says, when he fell in Eden. So you really think of the arc of that story and you wonder about it. And then you look at Casey's own story, being a priest, coming into Egypt and then setting up the society there, and then traveling all around with the initiates of the White Brotherhood like Hermes, and then realizing Atlantis is going down. We need to save this information in the Hall of Records at Giza. And that's what they do, and it's Hermes, who they reinterpret as Thoth or Tehuda. And but Hermes, the Emerald Tablets and this whole history of this great initiate, while he was working with Ra-Ta laying out the pyramids in 10,500 BC. What's even weirder, if you look back at that, is the Casey reading suggests the reason they selected the spot. Remember, our history of the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx is 2,500 BC, the Cheops Pyramid. That's what they call the Great Pyramid. But Casey has it at 10,500 BC. But just to add icing on the cake, he says, they selected the spot because they were doing archaeology, and they realized 50,000 years earlier, this thing was an incredible power center. So it already had that even before it. So we're doing archaeology and being like, can this thing be 10,500 years old? Yes. Not only that, well, if you go back even further, these people understood the archaeoastronomy, and they were like, where was this really incredible power center? It was here in Giza, but way before 10,500 BC. So they were doing archaeology to find it. I find that absolutely incredible. And I think it kind of rounds out our understanding around it. But just my final thought on the Great White Brotherhood is that they've been, they're the ones who have inspired the mystery lineage line. And so all of those mystery teachings and traditions come directly from that source. And then the occult left-hand path schools that grew up sound just like the pollution that took place in what Steiner refers to as when the Belial group gets their hands on the initiates and they infiltrate the Emilius group. That's the turning point, and it looks like we've been battling with that fork in the road ever since. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think we're done.
I'm going to give the last quote to Carl Jung, who says, the power is inside of you. Learn to operate it.
Oh, that's real good. Always remember to go with it. I absolutely agree with that. And again, I'm just a journalist. I do my best to give you as much on the spiritual side as I can. But the next chapter on these things, Gigi Young and her spiritual work, things of this nature, that's a great place to follow up on the things that we're presenting here. The Casey work through the ARE, all that's available. Anthroposophy, so much in the Gurdjieff work, theosophy. There's so many of them. We try to cover them because I think it's so important. And to share that experience. So many of you are in the Ideas Room who've emailed me, and you're very knowledgeable about this. And I think that you're part of this wave of a new realization sweeping through humanity. And, you know, the important thing is that that wave takes place. It doesn't have to be the majority. But, you know, it gets in there. It gets in there. It's the little line that grows. And that's really, I think, how I see it. But this is a crucial period, I think, for us to really take the things that were vouchsafed for us through the public mystery schools and utilize them. And that we're seeing so much of that take place now. And Miss Olivia, your super chats.
I've got a lot of people to thank. Okay, Kat Gray, James Cregan, Erica Swenson Elliott, Gillen Joy R, Simone Nyman, Occult Fan, Eurythmia's Fun, Friendly Magus, Bobo the Clown, Virgo Moon, Karen Carpenter, Michael Golpe, Norman Smith, Wait a Minute 72, Kelly Green, Francis Perot, Jim Sarge 3ID, Charles Marlowe, Sandra Lavender, Doreen Hewitt, Emma Peel, Transcendent Music, Medley Childress, Stephanie, Diane Mulligan, Havardian, Stephen, Jennifer Hart, Barry 7676, Seesaw 401, Lavish, Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, The Buddhas of Boston Sports, Shy Dan, Kelly Ross, Pinochet's Helicopter Tours, Sandra M, IC Butts, Wayne Peak, Jay Vandervest, Peter Patton, Bob Binder, W.C. Ray, Kevin Kelso, Melody Lenz, Johnny Ricardo Bone, and Violet Lotus. Thank you so much.
Unbelievable. Incredible support. We really appreciate it. And it makes all the difference to the work that we're doing for you here. We couldn't do it without you. And I want to say that to everyone who supported us tonight, and also to all our subscribers. We really appreciate it from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you. We will be back next week, and we also have some very interesting interviews and special reports coming up, as you can imagine. I want you to have a great weekend. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs here. Oh, right. I can show him. Frank Monday, he's out there. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Frank. Grant Alexander. Black Zionist. Carl Jung. Outstanding. Believable, belovable. I like that. Vina Zarazi. Excellent.
Can I throw you a question I wanted to ask?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. As far as sort of, are we behind schedule? Has humanity been remiss? Are we, as far as the Great White Brotherhood is concerned, have we not been utilizing their help and their support? Can we make up for lost time? Now that the pressure's on? Since they've been with us for so long and we have not made a lot of progress.
That's a really good question, actually. Well, the way I would look at that is I think there were opportunities that opened up. I think the Kennedy era opened up dramatic opportunities for the culture to move forward and be freedom-based. And, you know, for me, looking at that, I can see the opportunity and how it was shot down. Then you look at other things that happened. We had the great realization after Vietnam that war was stupid, you know, and that was a huge realization. But then we got sucked into the oil wars in Iraq and, you know, raided Baghdad and all that mess. So we've needed something more than what we've been getting from our spiritual leaders, our political leaders, our entertainers, and all the rest of it. And everyone needs to take kind of a look in the mirror and say, you know, this technocratic and transhumanist, you know, scientific materialist future ain't it. And those are the people who are on the march right now. And if anything, need to be stopped through better action on the side of good politicians, good entertainers, you know, good everyday people in society. And I think on the spiritual side of things, we had incredible movements. Again, that whole thing through the 60s and 70s, there were great self-help movements in the 80s, all these different things. And all that gets completely diverted. I think we're even making a lot of progress on the UFO thing. And all that gets completely diverted And what we see instead is, this kind of dystopian nightmare, and that's what's been getting the upper hand. So we need to kind of put ourselves in a place where we can say, okay, things have gone far enough, and we do get the message, and we have absorbed it. It has been left, it's been vouchsafed for us, and we're moving forward on that track. We do see what the trap has been. I think if enough people do that, then yeah, we can make up for lost time. But do I think sometimes I look at it and I say, it's too long. It's taking too long for that to happen on a larger scale. And I feel like the overreach on the side of the establishment during the COVID crisis and all the rest is a great awakening tool. And I think that, we're at a place where there's a lot of imitation progress. Like the CIA loves you and the UFO file, they're going to give you disclosure because they want to bring you to Jesus. I mean, no way, So on the anniversary of the CIA doing that, the only thing I want to do is expose their operation, because that's a harvesting of humanity, and God knows what they would do with those results. So to sum up your very good question, what I would say is that we need a new level of understanding in society that comes out of the ripple that these mystery schools left behind. There's a spiritual awakening in that I think can restore ideas of freedom and progress and independence that are crucial, and also our love of our own, community and spirituality. I mean, it's taken an incredible hit because they've set everybody at each other's throats. And what we need to do is really take the lesson of the things that have happened and turn things around. And that's what I think we're doing with conversations like what we're having here in the Ideas Room tonight, and with the great work that you did tonight as well, Miss Olivia. Outstanding. Thank you very much. Thank you, Najat. Great to see you out there. I'll do a couple more here. Michael Gale Media. Wonder if. Thanks, DJ. Thank you, sir. Thank you, DJ. Happy to support you. Ravel on one. Thank you, subscribers. Great to see you out there. Outstanding. We have some exciting things coming up for subscribers. Steiner to God. There you go, sir. Outstanding. Michael Golpe is out there. Great question. Yes, that was a great question. Outstanding. Fantastic. Carl Young, G. Taylor, keep up the stellar work. Wait, let's see that one. Danielle Jorgensen, fantastic. It was great. It was great to have Gigi out there. Like I said, check out her latest on Steiner and Ahriman and Lucifer. Outstanding, just outstanding. And what else did I want to tell you about?
Can you give Occult Fan an early happy birthday?
Hey,
for Hobbit Day next week?
Well, we'll be in the pocket there when it happens for sure. But it's great to see you out there. There's Occult Fan. Thank you very much. Thanks for being out there. Scarlet Fire, outstanding. The eighth sphere is the egg from whence blue chickens come. That's classic Occult Fan poetry right there. You got it. You nailed it, sir. Fantastic. Okay, we will see you next week. What signal? That's a good question. Hey, happy birthday. They're already coming out with the happy birthdays for Occult Fan. Yes, sir. DJ Katz. There you go. Thomas Tyson. I know Gigi was out there, like I said. Mm-hmm. Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Such a great
I want to say thank you, Shashakila, who always reminds everybody to hit the like button.
Shamanus Anamkara, too. Great to see you. Fantastic. Great group in the Ideas Room tonight. I salute you for getting through it all. We will see you all next week. Watch for some special reports coming up, and have a great weekend, everyone. And it says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
Never really ends. And remember, go to darkjournalist.com. If you don't already have a newsletter subscription, go ahead and sign up And we will see you all next week.
Okay.
So bye-bye, everyone.
God bless.